Chapter 1. Sally Jackson glanced up at the knock on the door of her classroom. Most people didn't bother to knock, so she was a bit startled at the intrusion. "Come in." When the door opened, she inhaled sharply, surprised by the person standing in front of her. Jay? Jay Graber? He looked as good as ever, and she felt butterflies in her stomach at the sight of him. Sally. He looked at her, pain filling his eyes. He'd been sure the Miss Jackson his niece Allison had told him about was his own Sally, but until he'd stepped into her classroom, it hadn't really hit him how hard it would be to see her again. "I need to talk to you about my niece." Sally frowned, shrugging. "Your niece?" He wasn't there to see her? Why would he be? "You rejected him, remember?" Allison Jolly. Allison was a student of hers, but she'd had no idea of the relation to Jay, the only man she'd ever loved. Allison was in her sophomore honors English class, so she was around 15 or 16. "I didn't realize she was your niece," he nodded. "Yeah, she is. She says you're giving her too much homework, and she can't keep up." She raised an eyebrow. "She's in honors English. Of course there's a lot of homework. There needs to be." She sighed, hating that she was seeing him again this way. "I heard you'd left town." Jay sat down on the chair she kept next to her desk. "I did. After what happened between us, I thought it was best." "Where did you go?" The rumors never said. And she'd listened as much as she could. Of course, she'd had her hands full with raising her niece, who had been just 10 at the time. Does it matter? It does to me. Sally hadn't realized he thought their relationship was over. She'd told him that it wasn't a good time for them to marry because she had gotten custody of her niece, and she didn't feel like she could divide her time. May had just lost her mother, and her father had disappeared. May had needed every bit of love Sally had in her to give, but it wasn't supposed to be forever. "I went up to Alaska and worked as a ranger in Denali National Park. It's still rough up there, and they needed young men with no ties." She frowned. "I didn't want you to leave. I just needed to cool things off between us for a little while." He shook his head. "I asked you to marry me, and you said May had to be first in your life. That told me what I needed to know." She knew she'd hurt him all those years ago, but she hadn't meant to. "I'm sorry for how things ended between us." Jay simply shrugged. "About my niece. Do you have custody of her now?" Was that what had brought him back to town? She knew realistically it couldn't have been her. She didn't want to let him change the subject, but he'd come to see her for a specific reason, and it obviously wasn't to rehash their old relationship. "Yeah. Her parents were killed in a car wreck right before school started. That's why I'm back in Wiggyville, living on the ranch where I grew up." "It was good of you to come back for her." "I'm not an ogre, and I'm her last living relative. Anyway, can you ease up on the homework?" Sally shook her head. "The only way for me to do that would be to put her into the regular English class and take her out of honors. Is that what she wants?" Jay closed his eyes for a moment. He couldn't believe she was being so unreasonable. "She just needs a few months to get over her parents' deaths." "Of course she does, but I can't just make her homework lighter and not do the same for everyone. I know when May came to live with me, she needed the distraction of homework." "You're doing this to get back at me for leaving." "Doing what?" "I've been teaching the same class for over 20 years. It's no harder than it was when I started teaching here." Sally sighed. "What's happened between us is history, ancient history. It's Allison we need to worry about now." She opened her grade book. "She's got 2 essays she hasn't turned in. If she can get them to me by Monday morning, I won't mark her down for being late." "You want her to write 2 essays in one weekend? That's insane." She shook her head. "It's really not. She's a smart girl. What if she needs help?" "She said she doesn't understand the play." Sally frowned. "I'll work with her on Saturday night if she really doesn't understand." "I don't mind." Jay raised an eyebrow. "No plans on Saturday night?" I've never had much of a social life, and since May married in August, it's worse than ever. She didn't add that he was the only man she'd dated since college. Why bother? He'd already decided she wasn't worth his time. May got married? Jay shook his head. Isn't she 16 or something? Sally smiled at that. She's 33, and a best-selling author. She's absolutely incredible. Her satisfaction in her niece came through strong in her voice. What does she write? He'd never been much of a reader. Romantic comedy. I'm pretty proud of her. He wrinkled his nose. Romance? Sally nodded. I used to laugh at romances, but you know what? May's as smart as they come, and I've read her books. She's good. Forgive me if I don't read one to see if I agree with you. She shrugged. Do what you want, but don't discount romance as if it's not worth reading. I used to, but now I know that for most women, they're the only form of happily ever after they'll ever get. He raised an eyebrow. I offered you a happily ever after, and you told me you didn't want it. Remember? I told you I needed some time before I could take it. There's a difference. Why would it have been so much harder to raise May with a man there to help you? Did you think I was that terrible with children? He'd thought that marrying her and sharing her load would make her life easier, not harder. Sally rubbed her hands over her face. The night before you asked me to marry you, I'd gotten home to find May holding an empty bottle of pills in her hand. I asked her what she was doing with it. Do you know what she told me? He shook his head. No idea. She told me she wished it was full so she could take them all and just escape. She wanted to be with her mother because it was too hard on earth. Sally felt a tear drift down her cheek. I knew her father had trouble with depression, and I figured that's why he'd disappeared. I couldn't let her go down that road as well. She needed my 100%, not only the part of me that wasn't busy being a newlywed with you. Why didn't you tell me that then? Jay stared at her, wishing that she'd told him with everything inside him. He'd have waited for as long as it took, if he'd known there was something to wait for, because I didn't feel like it was my story to tell. He showed up last month, which shocked both of us. Her father? Are you kidding me? Was that the first time? Sally nodded. May didn't want to see him. I talked her into it because I knew that even if she chose never to see him again afterward, she needed the closure. He didn't have any right to see her after all that time. 20 years with no contact? She should have slapped him and walked out. He tried to kill himself. He spent 6 months institutionalized, and then he watched her from afar. He knew he wasn't up to taking care of her, so he left her with me. She shook her head. He was there for her valedictory speech, for her college graduation. All the milestones he could be there for, he was. He just didn't tell her he was there. Did she forgive him? Yeah, she forgave him. I don't think she'll ever trust him again, though. She's taking it slowly. I'm supposed to call him as soon as she goes into labor. Wait, May's pregnant? He smiled. I guess this means you're going to be a grandmother. Sally's grin transformed her face to the young woman he remembered. He'd never known her to be carefree because he'd met her as her sister was dying of breast cancer, but she hadn't always had the weight of the world on her shoulders. Yeah. She and Bob are having a baby. Don't know if it's a boy or girl yet, but I kind of hope it'll be a girl, even if Bob will insist on naming her Bobette. He wrinkled his nose. Bobette? Are you kidding me? She shook her head. She married Bob Bodefeld. Why is that name familiar to me? Did he live in Wiggyville way back when I was here? No, he's an actor. He's on the show Lazy Love. Jay shrugged. I've heard of it, but never seen it. It's a good show. May has watched it since the first episode. I see. It sounds like she's happy. I'm glad. Even though you gave up my happiness for her. She is happy. And best of all, she's a good person. Sally stacked the things she needed to take home into a pile, getting ready to leave. It was already well after 5. I'll come by around 7 on Saturday evening. Does that work? Yeah, that's fine. He opened her door for her, took her books, and walked her to her car just as he had so many times in the past. She stopped in front of her small red car, using her remote to unlock it. She didn't usually drive to school because she lived close by, but it had been raining when she'd left that morning. Thanks for carrying my books, she said softly. He had done that for her several times back when they were dating. He'd stop by school after the students left and visit her classroom. Their first kiss had been in the same room where he'd just visited her. You still live in the same house? He asked, his mind obviously going back to their relationship all those years ago as well. She nodded. Yeah, it was a tight fit for the two of us, but now that May's on her own, I'm fine there. It's a good little house. He nodded, giving her books back to her. I'll see you on Saturday, I guess. I'll be there. She put her books into the passenger seat and started the car, slowly closing the door. As she pulled out onto the main street of Wiggyville, he was still standing in the same place, watching her drive away. Sally opened her front door and walked to the dining room, putting her books on the table. She collapsed into one of the chairs and buried her face in her hands, her mind automatically playing scenes from the past. The first time she'd met Jay, they'd been at the hardware store where he'd been buying some nails for fence repair while she'd been trying to decide which tool kit to buy for her new house. He'd picked up a basic kit, without the cute pink case she'd been eyeing, and handed it to her. You won't need anything more than this. Are you sure? She'd asked. What about the pink one? She was really drawn to it, and looked back and forth between it and the one he'd handed her. He shrugged. The tools look cheap, and you'd pay twice as much for less quality. Unless you're stupid, and I can see you're not, don't buy the pink. She smiled. Thanks. I appreciate your help. No problem. You just get your own place? She nodded. I did. I had an apartment in Weatherford for a while, but I just bought a house here in Wiggyville. I teach English at the high school. He'd made a face. You like all that poetic nonsense, then? She smiled. Some of it. Not all. I'm not a huge fan of Burns or Wordsworth, but I'll read Rostand any day of the week. Rostand? Never heard of him. The only thing he's known for is Cyrano de Bergerac. I'd be willing to bet that I'm the only person of your acquaintance to have read the play 47 times. He laughed. 47, huh? Is it that good? I think so. She'd started walking toward the checkout counter, glad to see he was walking with her. I'm Sally, by the way. Sally Jackson. Jay Graber. Good to meet you. What do you do, Jay Graber? He'd rubbed the back of his neck, obviously embarrassed that she was showing an interest in him. I'm a rancher. My folks retired and moved to Florida. Left me the ranch. I thought people from the north were supposed to retire to Florida, not people from Texas. My mom has this obsession with Disney, and they moved out there to be close to the mouse. I don't get it, but I guess I'm not supposed to. Well, that's cool. Do they go often? Every day, it seems. Dad says if he never sees another Disney princess, it'll be too soon. She laughed. I guess that's the way it goes. She set the tool kit he'd chosen on the counter and paid for it. Thanks for helping me. I really appreciate it. No problem. He shuffled his feet for a minute, looking down at his hands. Do you want to give me your number? You know, in case you need some help fixing something? If I need help, and you have my number, how will you know I need help? She asked logically, loving his shyness. I guess I'll have to give you mine too. He blushed, obviously embarrassed that she'd pointed out the error in his thinking. Okay, what I really want to know is if I can have your number and take you out for dinner sometime. She pulled a pen and scrap of paper from her purse and quickly scrawled her name and number. I'd love to go to dinner with you. Call me. She'd rushed from the store, feeling bold. She'd never given her number to a man she'd just met before. All of her college friends had called her weird and old-fashioned, but she hadn't cared. Now, though, she was willing to take a chance because she could tell this man was really special. Sally rubbed her hand over her face. She was older now. She didn't even know if Jay had married since she'd last seen him. Having him walk into her classroom had been a shock. She wished she could say she hadn't thought of him in years, but she had. Every single day. She'd never been able to get him out of her mind, or her heart. She stood and started to prepare dinner. Another lonely meal. Another lonely night. Just like all the others. Jay watched as Sally drove away, flooded with memories of her. He was glad he'd had time to prepare for seeing her again, because if they'd just run into each other in town, he wasn't sure he'd have been able to handle it. It had taken all his willpower not to lean down and kiss her. Her lips looked as soft as he'd remembered. She'd gained a little weight over the years, but she looked better now. She'd been much too thin before. He walked to his truck, sliding behind the wheel and heading to the house he shared with his belligerent 15-year-old niece. He knew she'd been through a lot, but she didn't have to be so snotty to him. He should ask Sally if May had ever gone through a phase of hating her, because she was the one who'd lived while her mother had died. As he drove, he thought about his first kiss with Sally. He couldn't get her out of his mind. He never had. All those years in Alaska, sometimes he wouldn't see anyone for days on end. All those nights dreaming of her. He'd gone to her classroom a couple of weeks after meeting her. They'd been on a few dates, but he hadn't been able to get up the courage to kiss her. He'd spent all day talking to his horse as he'd mended fences, trying to figure out how he was going to get past the milestone. Every time he looked at her, his knees turned to mush. He was surprised he was able to speak coherently in her presence. Walking through the empty halls to her class, he almost turned back 3 times. Finally, he'd mumbled to himself, "Just do it. She won't bite." Probably. And would it be so bad if she did? The humor had made him go on. He knocked at her door and waited for a moment, entering when she'd called, "Come in." She'd looked surprised, but happy to see him. "Hi. I didn't think I'd see you again till Friday evening." He shrugged. "I just thought I'd come see if you needed someone to carry your books." His words had sounded lame, even to him, but he'd already lost his nerve. He couldn't kiss her. Sally had smiled at him, standing up and walking around her desk to sit on the edge of it. "Really? You came all this way to see if I needed someone to carry my books?" He'd started to nod, but shook his head. No, he took a deep breath, knowing he had to get the words out or they'd still just be dating in 30 years, and he'd never even hold her hand. "I came to kiss you." Her grin told him it had been the right thing to say. "You did?" He nodded. "I did, but then I lost my courage and almost left. 3 times. He sighed. "I'm a dork." She laughed softly. "Maybe a little, but I really like dorks." "Have I mentioned that before?" He stared at her for a moment, his hands turned up as he wondered what he should do. "Does that mean you want me to kiss you?" She nodded. "I'd already decided I was going to grab you and kiss you on Friday night if you didn't kiss me." "Oh, you did? Wanna demonstrate?" "Nope, 'cause you came here to kiss me. Now you have to do it." He'd swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He'd kissed girls in high school, but never one who made him feel as much as Sally did. She was special, and he didn't want to ruin anything. "I wouldn't mind if you wanted to kiss me instead." She shook her head, walking toward him and putting her hands on his shoulders. "Nope. You have to kiss me." In the end, they'd kissed each other. Her arms had gone around his neck, and he'd leaned down to brush her lips with his. He lifted his head and whispered, "Thank you." She'd giggled. "Did you just thank me for kissing you?" "I told you I was a dork, didn't I?" he asked, resting his forehead against hers. "You did." She stroked his cheek with her fingers, liking the feel of his stubble. "I'm glad you came. I was starting to think you were dating me to learn about literature. I don't think I've ever felt this way about a woman before, and I'm kind of lost." Sally smiled at that. "Those words are better than any kiss." Are you sure you haven't been sneaking and reading some of that romantic literature you say is so sappy? He chuckled. Well, I've rented Cyrano de Bergerac. With subtitles. I'm not sure I think it's as great as you do, but I watched it a few times. Really? You have? Her heart fluttered at his words. He'd rented her favorite movie. The one with Gerard Depardieu? He nodded, blushing a little. You said you love it, so I wanted to see what it was all about. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him again. It's not my favorite translation, but I think that's awesome. You have a favorite translation? Are you kidding me? She laughed, shaking her head. Nope. I like the one by Brian Hooker. He makes the rhymes work. I took some French in college, just so I could learn enough to read it in the original, but I still prefer that translation. I'm going to have to go find it, aren't I? Only if you want to. But I'll tell you a secret. He leaned down, sniffing deeply as he did. She didn't wear perfume, but there was something about her that just smelled right to him. What's that? There's a black and white version with Jose Ferrer that uses the Brian Hooker translation. No subtitles. He grinned. And this is why you're so special. I don't have to read it. She laughed. Most people don't enjoy reading plays like I do. I understand that. If it'll help me understand you better, I'll read it, but I would rather watch the movie. She wrapped her arms around him, hugging him tightly. I appreciate the effort. She rested her cheek against his shoulder, just for a moment. I need to go home. It's late. After she'd stacked her books, he took them from her. I never thought I'd be carrying the teacher's books. She'd grinned at him. I never thought I'd let a man carry my books. He carried them to her house, surprised she hadn't driven. You don't bring your car to school? I only drive when it rains. A beautiful day and a beautiful town. Who wouldn't want to walk? He'd left her at her door with a soft kiss and a promise to see her on Friday evening, a date that had never happened. Her sister had died the next day, and a month later, May had moved in, changing everything between them. His immediate thought had been to marry her and help raise the 10-year-old girl. He'd honestly been surprised when she'd turned him down, feeling like he'd been kicked in the teeth. She'd said it wasn't a good time for her to marry, but he couldn't imagine waiting 8 years to marry the woman he loved. 8 years was forever. Now, over 20 years later, he wasn't sure what he'd been thinking. She was still on his mind day in and day out. She was his other half, the woman he'd never been able to forget. He had to get her to forgive him. Somehow. Chapter 2. Sally tossed and turned all night, thinking of nothing but Jay. She'd messed things up with him badly all those years ago, and she knew he probably still hated her. She wondered if he'd married. He probably has a wife and 3 kids by now. She pictured him with a petite blonde, kids running around him, and her heart ached. Getting up for school Friday morning was hard. Harder than she'd imagined it ever would be. She wanted to keep Allison after class and grill her about her uncle, but she knew that wasn't the answer. When Allison came into Sally's first period class, she stopped at her desk, frowning down at her. Uncle Jay says you're going to come over to tutor me on Saturday night. Don't waste your time. Sally bit her lip, unsure how to respond. Allison was angry, something she'd noticed in the young girl more than once. I'll be there because I promised your uncle. I don't have a problem helping you. Allison rolled her eyes and walked to her desk, pulling out her copy of Hamlet. She hid behind it the whole time they discussed the play. Why was Hamlet so upset about his mother's remarriage? Sally asked the class, trying not to notice Allison's attitude. The class discussion was good that day, something Sally was thankful for. There were only 10 students in the honors classes, so sometimes the conversation lagged more than she'd like. After class, Sally tried once more to talk to Allison. I'll see you on Saturday evening. Allison shrugged and left the room, obviously not caring what her English teacher did. At lunch that day, the new math instructor sat next to Sally in the faculty lounge. Any big plans for the weekend? He asked. Sally shook her head. Just the usual. Grading papers. I'm having dinner with my niece and her husband on Sunday evening. Your niece married Bob Bodefeld, right? Sally nodded. Everyone in town was hoping to get invited to the set, and she was sure Mr. Ward was no different. She did. That's really cool. What's he like? Just like everyone else. He's completely head over heels in love with my niece, which is fun to watch. She's pregnant, and he's almost got her convinced the baby should be called Bob or Bobette. Bobette? Are you kidding me? Sally shook her head. She's a romance writer, and she says she's tired of naming characters, and if he's willing to choose, she'll put up with anything he wants. That's awful. I know. I keep telling her that, but she just smiles and goes on her merry way. Mr. Ward shrugged. To each his own, I guess. I don't exactly have a say in the matter. I feel like the baby is my grandchild, but it's really not. He cleared his throat nervously. So, if you're spending Sunday evening with them, you're free on Saturday evening? Sally looked at him, startled. She hadn't realized he was interested in her. No, I have a student I'm going to tutor. Really? Do you usually do private tutoring? She shook her head. No, there are extenuating circumstances. How about Friday night, then? I'm sorry, Mr. Ward. I'm really not interested. She hated to be so blunt, but she was sure it was better just to let him know. Her heart still belonged to Jay Graber. She hadn't dated another man since he'd left town all those years before. What was the point? Her feelings weren't going to change. Oh? Is there someone else? She started to say no, but nodded instead. Actually, there is. My heart's been taken for a very long time. Mr. Ward stood, crumpling the wrapper from the sandwich he'd brought for his lunch. Sounds like it's time he put a ring on it. Don't you think? Sally didn't respond. She had no idea what to say to that. Jay had tried to put a ring on it, and she'd told him no. Pulling into Jay's driveway on Saturday night brought back another rush of feelings. Sally hadn't spent much time with him at his house, because they'd preferred to be in public places for the most part. She didn't believe sex should happen before marriage, and they decided it would be smarter not to tempt themselves by spending much time alone. She had gone out one afternoon for a picnic shortly after May had arrived, and the three of them had ridden together and even shared a picnic lunch. Sally had been thrilled with how well May got along with Jay. It was less than a week later that he'd proposed. Sally shook her head, refusing to worry about the past, and walked to the back door, where she knew friends and family were expected to go. She rang the bell and waited. Jay opened the door for her, and her heart skipped a beat. Why couldn't she look at him and not feel so much? It was like she walked around only half alive when he wasn't there with her. Thanks for coming. She's in a mood. He wasn't sure why he bothered with the warning, because Allison was always in a mood. Sally nodded. I tried to talk to her a bit at school yesterday, and she just got mad. I'm willing to try, but I can't promise I'll get through to her. I appreciate the effort. Maybe we can talk when you're done? She looked at him for a moment, wondering what he wanted to talk about. Sure. He turned. Allison. Miss Jackson's here. Allison came from the hallway where Sally knew the bedrooms were. She didn't say anything as she walked to the dining room table, slapping a spiral notebook down and grabbing a pen. Sally walked over and took the seat beside her student. The papers you missed were both on Cyrano de Bergerac. Was there something you didn't understand about the play? Or the assignment? She felt Jay's eyes on her, knowing he was remembering her obsession with Cyrano. She hadn't read the play in years outside of her sophomore English class, because it always reminded her of Jay now. Of course, just about everything did. I don't know. Sally sighed. Allison, I'm more than willing to help you in any way I can. You can catch up on the work, and I'll help you do that, or I can request that you be transferred into a regular English class. The choice is yours. You just want me out of your class. You hate me. Why on earth would I hate you? I barely know you. Everyone knows you and Uncle Jay were a couple, and he dumped you 'cause your niece moved in with you. What? Sally shook her head, beckoning Jay to come closer when she saw him listening. That's not what happened at all. My mom told me he left town because you two split up over your niece. Sally closed her eyes, trying to find the right words. How much should she tell the girl? Jay took the seat across from them, looking at Allison. Did you think I didn't want you here because of that? Allison shrugged, a tear rolling down the side of her nose. You don't want me, and she doesn't want me in her class. I know it. He looked across the table at Sally. Do you mind if I tell her exactly what happened? Sally shook her head. I don't mind at all. I think you need to. I was dating Miss Jackson when her niece moved in with her, but I didn't leave town because I didn't want to help her raise her niece. On the contrary. I asked her to marry me, and she said no. I couldn't deal with being close to her after we split, so I left town. I wouldn't have come back if it wasn't for you. You were worth coming back for. He kept his gaze on his niece's face until she met his eyes, hoping she'd be able to read the truth in his. Sally nodded. Most of that is true. I didn't say no, though. I said, not right now. I was hoping he'd give me a year or two and then we could get married, but he left right away. Allison looked back and forth between them. You really asked her to marry you? He nodded. I sure did. So why do you hate him, then? Sally shook her head. I don't. I've never hated him. Then why do you hate me? I don't. I didn't even realize you were Jay's niece until he came to see me at school the other day. You don't even have the same last name. Sally looked intently at the girl. Why do you think I hate you? Allison shrugged. Haley Mark said you did. Her mom was in your class when you guys broke up. Sally leaned back, astounded. I had no idea any of my students even knew I had dated your uncle. It only lasted for a few months. She sighed. I don't hate you at all. I worry about you, because I know your parents died, and I know what a tough time my niece had when she went through the same thing. Allison stared at her. You really never hated me? Sally shook her head. I've never hated a student. Actually, I probably would have given you preferential treatment if it had occurred to me who your uncle was. Really? Sally frowned. I hope not, but probably. I always did have a soft spot for him. Allison looked at her uncle as if seeing him for the first time. I guess he's not hideous. Sally laughed at her words. No, I've never thought he was hideous. Allison shrugged. I guess we need to talk about Cyrano, huh? I kind of think Roxanne was an idiot for thinking Christian was able to write letters like that. He's such a dweeb. Yeah. Pretty much. Cyrano, no matter what he looks like, is the perfect hero. I mean, who wants a man that all the other women are going to be after anyway? So that's why you liked Uncle Jay, because all the other women weren't chasing him? Sally blushed, nodding at the book on the table. Let's talk about Cyrano and leave Jay out of this. Allison made a face. I'd rather talk about real-life love than fictional love. Now that Uncle Jay is back in town, are you going to go out with him? I think we really should concentrate on Cyrano. Sally had no answers where Jay was concerned, but she knew if he asked, she'd go out with him in a heartbeat. She wasn't sure how that would work out with Allison being her student, though. Allison looked at Jay. Well, are you going to ask her out? Jay stood up. I think I'll go feed the horses. Study hard. He quickly left the house, and Sally couldn't hold back a giggle. Allison looked at her. You giggled, Sally shrugged. I am human, you know. Everyone says that you're the hardest teacher in school, and that you're always serious. I'll own up to being the hardest teacher. Always serious? Do people really say that? Sally knew she was tough, because she expected each student to give their all. She didn't like hearing that people thought she was always serious, though. Had she forgotten how to laugh? Everyone says that you only love literature, and that you're so in love with Cyrano, you'll never settle for a real man. Sally sighed. I have been in love with Cyrano since I was your age, I admit it. What about Uncle Jay? I loved him too. Now, let's talk about your homework. An hour later, Allison had outlines written for both essays, and the first one partially done. Sally wondered where Jay was hiding as she got to her feet. I think you've got this. I'll expect your essays first thing Monday morning. Allison frowned at her for a moment as if unsure what to think. Thanks for helping me, Miss Jackson. You're not the ogre everyone thinks you are. Thanks, I think. An ogre? Do students really call me that? I think you'd even be pretty if you wore your hair down sometimes. Fashion lessons from a 15-year-old honors student? She needed to leave. Quickly. Good night, Allison. Good night, Miss Jackson. Allison stayed seated, looking back down at her essay, her pen poised. Sally walked to the back door, to let herself out, glad to be out from under the scrutiny of the teen. She was almost to the car when she heard her name. Jay stopped her before she got into her car. How'd it go? Really well. I think she's going to be fine. She just had it in her head that I hated her. Once we worked everything out, she knew the material and was ready to work. I think she thought I was going to mark down her grade just because I used to date you and it didn't end well. Apparently, I have the reputation of being an ogre. He looked at her for a moment, studying her. You handled her really well. I'm good with teens. I teach them every day, and I even raised one. Was May angry? Allison seems so mad all the time. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that. Sally shook her head. No, May was sad, not angry. I wasn't sure she was going to pull through for a while, but she did. Allison is a very different girl from my May. May had been easier to handle, because all her anger had been turned inward. There'd been no fights, but there had been a long process of trying to build up the girl's self-esteem. Sally wished she'd done a better job of that because May still didn't believe she was worth much. She hoped that was changing with Bob in her life. He sighed. I was hoping you'd be full of wisdom about how to handle Allison's anger. I wish I had the answers. She seems like a sweet girl. She was very interested in our relationship. Maybe if you just sit down and talk to her as if she's your friend and not your niece, it would help. That's kind of how I had to relate to her to make the tutoring work. It was how she'd always related to May as well. She'd made it clear she had the authority, but she was also there to be a listening ear and a friend. It had worked for them. I've missed you. He hadn't meant to blurt it out quite that way, but once the words were out, he was relieved. Are you seeing anyone? She shook her head. No. I haven't dated anyone since you left. Really? He shook his head. You mean all the single male teachers at school aren't after you? He found it hard to believe she hadn't dated at all in the years they'd been apart. She shrugged. I get asked out on occasion. I make it clear I'm not interested. Because of May? She tilted her head to one side, trying to understand his question. What does May have to do with anything? She's married and pregnant. Why would I not date because of her? Why would you not date otherwise? That doesn't make sense to me. She wanted to tell him that she didn't date because she couldn't seem to stop thinking of him, but she couldn't give him that kind of power over her. Not yet. I guess there wasn't anyone I cared to date. I'm not a casual dater and never have been. If I go out with a man, it's because I think there could be a future. He took a deep breath, stepping closer to her. He'd lost some of his shyness over the years, but she still left him quivering in his cowboy boots. So, what would happen if I asked you to forget the past and go out with me? You don't have someone waiting for you in Alaska? She had to know. She had to understand what he'd been doing for the past 20 years. He shook his head. There aren't a lot of women in that part of Alaska. Not in the winter, at least. She bit her lip. I don't think I can forget the past. His heart sank. I understand. I do. I know I messed up, but I want you to at least think about it. Please. He opened her car door for her. I'm not sure I can keep going without you. I don't think you understand. I can't forget the past, because it's part of us. I'll go out with you, though. She wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of her life with him. She thought for a moment about what his reaction would be if she demanded the ring he'd once offered her. You will? Really? His eyes studied hers by the dim light coming from the house. She nodded. I will. You're the only man I could never say no to. You did once. She sighed, knowing she needed to address that if they were going to move forward. I did, and I don't regret it. I don't think May would have survived if I hadn't given her the time and attention she needed, but that doesn't mean I don't wish things had been different. I wish my sister had lived. I wish I could have said yes that night. All right. He didn't know what he wanted her to say about his proposal, but it wasn't that. Let's just move on, then. I'd like that a lot. She took a step toward him and wrapped her arms around him, not making a move to kiss him, but just holding him close. I've missed you more than I can say. His arms came around her. I want it to work out between us this time. I don't want to mess things up again. Oh, Jay. You never messed things up. I didn't either. It was circumstances that kept us apart. I should have explained exactly what was going on. I don't know if I would have waited even if you had. Back then, 8 years sounded like an eternity. She shook her head. I wasn't asking you to wait 8 years. Just until May was a bit more confident and less depressed. 1, maybe, but not much longer than that. She had a rough time, but she was at the top of her class by the end of the following semester. So if I'd still been around then, you'd have married me? I'd have dragged you down the aisle if I had to. He sighed. I really did mess things up, didn't I? I don't think so. If you were that willing to run off when I asked you to wait, you needed time as well. We both had some growing up to do. We were young and probably not ready. When I finally marry, it will be with the intention of never divorcing. I want it to be right. And you're willing to give me another chance? She nodded. I have to. He decided not to question her about it anymore. How about tomorrow night? We could have dinner in town. I'm having dinner with May and Bob. She stopped. You know what? You and Allison should join us. We're meeting at the Mexican place in Wiggyville at 6. Jay frowned. I can't horn in on your time with May. Why not? Bob is. Sally rested the palm of her hand on his chest, feeling the strength of his heartbeat beneath her fingers. Please join us. He finally nodded. It feels weird, but I'll be there if you're sure. I'm absolutely sure. And bring Allison. I don't want her to feel like she's not welcome. I'll ask Allison if she wants to come with me. You know, teenagers. She might not be willing to be seen in public with her uncle and her English teacher. Sally grinned. Her uncle's pretty darned handsome. If she's not willing to be seen in public with him, there's something wrong with her. Handsome, huh? You still think so? He covered her hand, which was resting on his chest, with his own. She nodded. Men only get better with age. Women get old and wrinkled. With his free hand, he stroked her cheek. Not you. You're as beautiful as you were the day I met you. She shook her head. Not hardly. But I am better at picking out tools than I was back then. He smiled. You couldn't be any worse. How many dates will we have to go on before you kiss me this time? Sally asked him. He shook his head. I'm not quite as shy as I used to be. I bet I can kiss you before we've had 6 or 7 dates. She laughed. Or now. You could kiss me now. He leaned down and brushed his lips gently against hers, feeling the same rush of feelings that had always been there with her. Only with her. We'll see you tomorrow night. As she drove back toward town, all she could think about was that kiss. How could she feel more than she had? She'd thought she loved him as much as was humanly possible 20 years before. Apparently, she'd had no idea what love was. Chapter 3. Late Sunday afternoon, Sally stood in front of the mirror in her bathroom, trying to figure out what to do with her hair. Allison's comment about her being pretty if she'd just wear it down was ringing in her ears. She'd been wearing it up for school for so long that she barely remembered ever fixing it any other way. Her dark hair was straight and went to her mid-back. It was probably time for a trim. She sighed, carefully brushing it until it shone. She'd wear it down, but she wouldn't be very comfortable doing it. Hopefully Jay would appreciate her efforts. She looked at the faint scar on her neck from her thyroid removal earlier that year. The doctor had done a good job and she could barely see it at all, but she was always aware it was there. The word cancer would always be so much harder for her to hear now. Her phone rang about 15 minutes before it was time to leave for the restaurant, and she grabbed it, glancing at the caller ID. Jay. How had he gotten her cell number? She hadn't had one when they'd dated before. Hello? We never said if I was supposed to pick you up or just meet you there. She felt her heart flutter at the sound of his deep voice. It was one of the first things she'd noticed about him. He could talk to her nonstop forever, and she'd never get tired of hearing his deep, gravelly voice. I was just planning to walk over, but if you want to walk with me, I wouldn't be opposed to that. Wouldn't that have you walking home alone after dark? Sally rolled her eyes. He'd always been overprotective of her. I can catch a ride home with May and Bob. We'll come walk with you. Don't leave before we get there. Allison's coming, then? She wasn't sure if she should be pleased or wary that the girl would be eating with them. She still hadn't quite figured her out. Though she wished for time alone with Jay, she knew it was best if the girl always felt included. Yeah. She said it would be fun to watch me or something like that. Sally frowned. What does that even mean? She thinks I'm a dork when you're around. Sally laughed. Well, you always have been. It's part of your charm. Yeah. You keep telling yourself that. See you in 10. She stared at her phone after ending the call, wishing she had the words to tell him exactly how she felt without giving him the power over her that love gave a man. She sighed, walking back to the mirror in the bathroom and adding lipstick. She was nervous. She hadn't been this nervous since their first date. She sat down and picked up her Kindle to read May's most recent book. It was all she could do to keep up with the girl. She could write as fast as Sally had time to read. Sally jumped at a knock on the door a few minutes later, put her Kindle down, and hurried to the door. The characters were about to kiss for the first time, and Sally felt cheated to have to wait to read about it. First kisses were one of her favorite parts of a romance novel. Jay stood at the door, a slight smile touching his lips. Allison was beside him, looking around inquisitively. I always wondered where teachers lived. Sally opened the door wide. Come in and wander around. I don't have anything to hide. She watched as Allison did as she asked, stopping to touch a framed picture of May. This is your niece? Yeah. I raised her from the time she was 10. Her parents died too? Sally shook her head. No, just her mom. Her dad is still alive. She wasn't about to tell the full story, though. It was May's to tell. It was enough that she'd told Jay. Jay touched her shoulder lightly, his hand running down along her arm to catch hers. Hi. She smiled at him. Hi. I like your hair like that. You always wore it down before. I got used to putting it up for school. It needs a trim. I think it looks wonderful. He brushed a strand of hair away from her face. It didn't need to be brushed away, but he needed to touch her. Sally smiled. You always were good for my ego. She turned when she heard a laugh. Wow. This was you guys back when you used to date? Jay walked over to where his niece was looking at a picture of the two of them. Oh, my. I remember that night. Sally, Miss Jackson, talked me into chaperoning a school dance with her. We spent the whole night pulling couples out of corners where they were making out. He shook his head. Miss Jackson looked beautiful, though, didn't she? Allison nodded, looking at her teacher curiously. I can't believe you went to school dances back then. Everyone says you don't do any extracurricular activities. You just teach. Sally shrugged. I think that's the only dance I've ever chaperoned. I volunteered because I knew I could talk Jay into going with me, and it might be the only time I ever saw him in a suit. Jay looked at her, his eyes wide. You did not. You told me you had to chaperone the dance, and it would be easier if I was there. I did have to chaperone, but only because I volunteered. He shook his head at her. Forcing me to wear a suit and hang around with teenagers all night. That was just evil. We got to dance a little. He sighed. We did. And we got to bust some kids for spiking the punch, and bust more kids for making out, and more kids for fighting. We could have just gone out dancing. I guess. It was more fun my way. Sally winked at him, a grin transforming her face. Allison just watched them. You two are crazy. Jay shook his head. Nope, just her. Someday I'll tell you about how we met. I saved her from spending too much on tools. Allison gaped. No way. Yup, and I asked for her phone number before we ever left the hardware store. He opened the front door for the two females to precede him. Hard to believe, isn't it? They walked the short distance to the Mexican restaurant, with Allison asking for details and Jay refusing to give them. Sally was surprised that Jay openly held her hand in front of his niece. When they got to the restaurant, they found May and Bob at a table for 5. Sally hugged her niece and sat down between Jay and Allison. May, you remember Jay, don't you? May nodded. I always wondered what happened to you. She had a cold look in her eyes. I moved to Alaska to be a park ranger, he said, picking up his menu. Her eyes widened, and the cold look disappeared. Are you serious? Can I pick your brain? I've been wanting to write a book set in Alaska. He shrugged. I heard you write romance. Seems strange that the little girl I knew grew up to be a famous writer. May sighed. I'm not so famous. I just write stories that make people laugh. Allison was openly gaping at Bob. You're on Lazy Love. Bob smiled. I am. Are you a fan of the show? I watch it every week. I'm a card-carrying member of Team Bob. May laughed. I was one of the 3 who started Team Bob. I write as Jolene. Jolene Gold. I've talked to you online a bunch. Allison was practically bouncing in her chair. Uncle Jay, you have to marry Miss Jackson. Then we'll be related to 2 famous people. May looked back and forth between her aunt and Jay curiously. Is marriage talk happening? Sally shook her head. Not at all. We decided to start dating again just last night. I still have the ring, though, Jay said, shrugging. May frowned. Wait. Ring? You bought her a ring? Jay nodded. Yeah, and she told me it wasn't the right time. She needed to focus on you. But I thought you two split because you didn't want me around. Sally looked at May, surprised. Why did you think that? I never said that. She'd avoided the topic of Jay whenever it had come up, refusing to talk about him at all. I know, but you broke up shortly after I moved in with you, and I figured it was my fault. Sally shook her head. I knew you needed more attention than I could give you if I was playing newlywed with Jay. I told him it wasn't the right time for me, and he thought I meant that I wanted to wait until you were 18, so he ran away to Alaska. I didn't even know he thought we'd broken up until I heard he'd left town. May looked at Jay, her face sad. I've thought not so nice things about you for years. I'm sorry. I almost killed you in a book and had it all planned out how you were going to be decapitated by a train, but I realized it might upset Aunt Sally. May noticed the look of horror on her aunt's face. I would never do that. I don't kill real-life people in books to feel better. Writing books isn't my therapy. I swear. Jay blinked a few times at May, trying to deal with what she'd just said. You almost killed me in a book. Do you do that often? May shrugged. Only when someone is really awful to me, or someone I love. A blonde waitress stopped at the table and took their drink orders. She wrinkled her nose at May. I hear you're having a baby. Don't you think it would have been smarter to wait a little longer before you got fatter? May smiled sweetly. Hi, Tiffany. How are things at home? Has Cody found a new job yet? My life is none of your business. Tiffany finished taking their orders and stomped off in a huff. May shook her head. I've killed her in a book, and I'm not even ashamed of it. Jay bit back a laugh. You aren't the little girl I remember. I don't think I saw you smile even once back then. I know. I was a mess. It's a good thing I had my aunt. I never would have made it through without her. Jay looked at Sally. She's pretty amazing. I wish I'd stuck around and waited like I should have. Of course, I learned a lot along the way, and I'll be a much better husband now. Is this a proposal? May asked excitedly. It sounds like a proposal. Doesn't that kind of sound like a proposal, Bob? Bob looked at May. I think your romance writerliness is coming out your ears again. You should eat a chip and figure out how many tacos little Bobby needs. May sighed contentedly. Tacos. I love tacos. Bob shook his head, patting May's shoulder. That baby is going to be born with grated cheese for hair. Sally grinned at Jay. May's been craving tacos. It's all she wants to eat. Jay looked at Allison, whose eyes were gleaming with excitement. Can I read one of your books, Mrs. Bodefeld? Allison asked, bouncing in her seat. May frowned, shaking her head. I'm not sure. Sally knew that May was uncertain what to say when a teenage girl wanted to read one of her books because May had read books with sex scenes when she was 11, but she knew not all parents approved of books like that for young girls. Sally leaned close to Jay and whispered her niece's dilemma. Jay shrugged. You read romances all the time, don't you, Allison? Allison nodded. Mom never minded. I think it's fine, then. Sally thought it best to go along with what Allison's had allowed for her. May leaned down and got a book out of her purse. Do you want me to sign it for you? Yes, please. May signed it quickly and then passed it to Bob. I bet she'd love an autograph from one of her favorite actors as well. Bob took the book and scribbled his name before passing it to the teen. We're filming late on Tuesday. I can get you and your uncle a pass to come watch, if you'd like. Allison looked at Jay, her eyes wide. Please, Uncle Jay? I want to meet Valerie and Jesse and Amber too. Jay sighed. If you're completely caught up in English by Tuesday morning, we'll go. He had no desire to watch a show get filmed, but if Allison was that excited about it, he could do it. It was one of the sacrifices that needed to be made as he raised her. Bob smiled. I'll leave passes for the three of you. Sally looked at Bob. 3? You haven't been out to the set yet either, Aunt Sally. Bob looked over at May. You should come too. Make it a party. May wrinkled her nose. I have to work. She sighed. Of course I'll be there. We'll have a party in Bob's trailer. Does Bob get no say in this? Sally asked. Why would he? I'm the queen, and he's just the court jester. Bob leaned over close to May and whispered King Bob loudly into her ear. Sally looked at Jay. Just ignore them. They're both crazy. Allison was practically bouncing up and down in her seat. Why don't you tell the class about the famous people you're related to, Miss Jackson? Sally shrugged. I don't see how any of it affects English literature, do you? I guess it doesn't, Allison said. But it would make you seem so much cooler. I'm not sure if you've realized this yet, Allison, but my life goal isn't to be cool. I probably would have chosen a cooler subject to teach if it was. Maybe not, but I see you took my advice and wore your hair down today. It looks good. Doesn't it, Uncle Jay? Jay smiled, squeezing Sally's hand under the table. It really does. And the next time I go out with you, I'm not bringing Allison, because she's way too interested in my love life. Your love life? Allison asked. You're in love with Miss Jackson? Jay blushed, shaking his head. A man in his 40s shouldn't be blushing. Drop it, Allison. My feelings for Miss Jackson are none of your business. Allison rolled her eyes, turning to Bob. What about Jesse and Valerie? Are they really in love? And I read Amber got married to some guy who lives in Jupiter, of all places. Who'd want to live in Jupiter, Texas? May laughed. I'll have you know that Jesse and Valerie are very much in love with each other. You should see how they look at each other all the time. It makes my heart melt. And Amber and John are happy too. She grew up in Jupiter, so she doesn't mind moving back. She leaned forward as if imparting a great secret to Allison. John took her to the prom in high school. She's been in love with him since she was 12. Wow. Allison sighed. I wish I had someone I loved that much. I didn't meet my husband until I was in my 30s. You have plenty of time to fall in love and marry. May smiled at the girl, knowing her life was similar to her own in some ways. What do you want to do when you finish school? Allison shrugged. I think I'll probably be a doctor. Like a pediatrician or something. I'm really good at biology. Much better than I am at literature. May grinned. I was better at literature. It was very fortunate for me that I had a live-in literature teacher when I was in high school. Did you always want to be a romance writer? May shook her head. Not exactly. I always knew I wanted to write books that would make people laugh. I read a lot of romance, so it makes sense that it's what I decided to write. It makes me crazy when someone writes something they call a romance and one of the main characters dies at the end. Allison nodded. Me too. Jay ignored the banter between the two nieces and leaned toward Sally. I don't care if people die in romances. Sally shrugged. If they do, they become a tragedy, but whatever. I'm glad you guys decided to come tonight. I love how well May and Allison are getting along. He looked back and forth between the two. Allison worked all day on her essays. She said she has a little bit more polishing to do, but they'll be ready to turn in tomorrow morning. Good. I would hate to have to fail your niece. But I'd do it. He grinned. And that's why you're known as the toughest teacher in school, and the prettiest. He winked at her, squeezing her hand. Tiffany came back with their drinks, obviously still angry with May for something no one else could really understand. Are you ready to order? She pulled a notepad from her apron and patted the front of herself, trying to find something to write with. May pulled out a pen and handed it to her with a smile. If you don't mind using one with my pseudonym on it, you can keep this. I know waitresses are always having their pens walk out on them. Tiffany took it, gripping it between her forefinger and thumb as if it was something she didn't want to touch. She took their orders and wandered off. Sally looked at May. Why does she hate you so much? May shrugged. I've wondered that a lot. She wasn't this terrible to me until I married Bob. I really think she had me in a little compartment in her brain that said I'd never be anything but a nerd and a loser, like she thought of me in high school. Then I became a best-selling author, and that bothered her. But when I married Bob, her opinion of me was blown out of the water. I married a sexy, successful actor, and she's married to a washed-up football player who lets her support him and their 3 kids. If I'd been unsuccessful, she wouldn't hate me so much. She took a bite of a chip. Just a theory, of course. Sounds like a good theory to me, Sally said. I remember how much she and her friends tormented you in school. Yup. Bullying at its finest. May didn't need to say anything else, because everyone at the table understood. Were you one of the smart kids who got picked on too? Allison asked, her eyes wide. Of course. May responded, winking. And Tiffany was the pretty cheerleader who always had a date on Friday night. In her mind, I was supposed to stay a loser forever. I didn't. It's hard for her to swallow that fact. Do you go to your high school reunions? Jay asked, suddenly wondering if others still treated her the same way. May shook her head emphatically. No way. No one in that school would give me the time of day when I went there. Why would I go out of my way to see them again? I see my favorite teacher all the time, but I don't need any of the rest of them. I'm surprised you haven't moved out of Wiggyville, Jay told her. I didn't want to leave Aunt Sally. I've thought about it a lot, though. I hate the summer heat. Allison frowned. You should move to Wyoming like Jessie and Valerie did. I'm sure you could find a nice place there. You'd still come to Wiggyville, because Bob would work here, but you could spend most of the summer where it's cool. And you'd come visit? May asked. I do love the mountains, Allison answered with a grin. Sounds good to me. We'll have to look into that. May rested her head on Bob's shoulder for a moment. Jay smiled over at Sally. May really was happy now. He was pleased to see the girl who had seemed so sad in a different light. Sally was right. May didn't need her anymore. He breathed a sigh of relief. Even if May didn't need her, he did. And he was going to find a way to marry her. Soon. Chapter 4. After dinner, Jay and Allison walked Sally home. At her front door, Allison looked between the older couple. Aren't you going to kiss her goodnight, Uncle Jay? That's what you're supposed to do after dates. Jay looked at his niece. So you want us to kiss so you can watch? Are you nuts? Allison shrugged. Probably a little. Isn't everyone? Jay shook his head, surprised at her attitude change. She was definitely a hormonal teen because her moods were more temperamental than the Texas weather. He leaned down and kissed Sally on the cheek. Good night, I'm really glad we did this. Sally smiled up at him. Me too. I'll see you Tuesday evening, I guess. Do you want to drive out together? Or do you want to meet there? What she really wanted was a bit of time alone with him, but she wasn't about to tell him that. She wouldn't hurt Allison's feelings that way. Let's drive out together. Sally looked at Allison. Are you sure you can go out on a school night and not get behind? Allison shrugged. I'll do fine. I was only behind in your class, and only because I figured you'd fail me no matter how hard I worked. Sally shook her head. I will if you don't do the work, but not because you're uncle and I didn't work out. I see that now. Good night, Miss Jackson. Good night, Allison. Jay ran his hand down Sally's arm before following his niece to his truck. He had to figure out some way to be alone with Sally. Allison wouldn't always get in the way. Would she? Sally went into the house and closed the door, leaning against it. Spending time with Jay had brought back so many memories. She had thought she was used to being alone and content. She knew now that would never be the case. No, she wanted Jay to be involved with every minute of her life. She walked toward her bedroom to get ready for bed. School started early. She hoped she'd be able to teach without her students realizing anything was different. Even as she walked to her room, it felt like she couldn't stop smiling. Surely the whole world would know she was in love the moment they saw her. As soon as the last bell rang on Tuesday, Sally gathered her things to leave. She usually stayed after school for at least an hour or two, but Jay was picking her up so they could drive out to the set. She wasn't a huge fan of the show, though she did watch it. It gave her more to talk about with May because she was so obsessed with it. Sally was just headed for her classroom door when it flew open, and Allison rushed in. Are you ready, Miss Jackson? I can't believe we actually get to watch them film some of the show. Sally grinned. It's going to be fun. May's never been there for filming either, but she's been invited a bunch. I think she's only going to keep us company. Allison held the door for Sally. I like May. She's cool. I read that book she gave me last night instead of doing my math homework, and it was really good. Sally shook her head. So, did you get your math homework done? It was hard to find the line with Allison between teacher, friend, and uncle's girlfriend. Yeah, I did it during biology. Biting her lip, Sally didn't say anything about that. Where is Jay meeting us? He was supposed to meet us here, but the vet took longer than he expected, so he said to walk to your house, and he'd pick us up there. Why don't you drive to school? Sally knew the vet was going to be at the ranch checking out Jay's favorite horse. I like to walk. I drive if it's rainy, but that's the only time. What happens if it rains while you're at school, and you're stuck there with no car? Sally shrugged. I get one of the other teachers to drop me off, or I walk home in the rain. It's not far. She actually loved to walk in the rain. She found it very soothing. I'm glad it's not raining today. Will you help me talk Uncle Jay into letting me get my learner's permit? I want to get a car and drive myself to school. You can't drive alone until you're 16 anyway. When will that be? Not until April, but I want to start learning now. Uncle Jay says I'm not ready, and I have to take driver's ed next semester. Sally shook her head. I'm not going to interfere between you two. Ever. Allison sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. Jay's truck was parked in front of her house when they got there. He was leaning against it and hurried to her, grabbing her books. I got out a little quicker than I thought, but school was already over, so I figured it would be best if I kept to the plan and waited here. Perfect. Sally went to the door, opening it. Let's leave my books here. I should probably grade papers while we're on the set, but I think that might ruin things for Allison. Allison nodded. It would. How could I have fun watching everything if you were grading my Cyrano papers? Oh, I graded those already. I'll give them back during class tomorrow. How'd I do? You think you're going to get special treatment now that I'm dating your uncle, don't you? Sally had a strict rule about not discussing grades outside of class. Any student was welcome to come talk to her after school if they were concerned about a grade. She'd made the policy the first year she'd taught at Wiggyville when one of her students had asked her for his grade when he'd run into her at the grocery store with his mother. The mother had gone into hysterics when she mentioned he was making a D. Allison grinned. Why not? Sally shook her head, laughing. Not happening. Jay set her books on the table and walked back to them. Let's head out. Are we going to be there long enough we'll need dinner? Sally shrugged. No idea. If we are, we'll just get something after. No big deal. I probably should have packed a picnic or something, but I wasn't sure what to do, he said. Allison grabbed his arm. Come on, Uncle Jay. Jay shook his head and walked toward the truck as Sally locked the door. She followed along behind, watching the two of them together. She could see a big difference in the way they interacted just in the short time she'd been around them. Allison was definitely a lot more comfortable with her uncle now. Sally slid into the passenger side while Allison got into the back seat. How was your day? What did the vet tell you? He's done something to his leg. The doctor put some kind of poultice on it and said he should be walking more normally by morning. Are you going to have to ride another horse for a few days? He shrugged. I could, but I'll probably just mend some of the fences close to home. I've been putting it off because I hate that job so much, but it's as good a time as any. At least the weather is cooler now. Sally turned and looked at Allison. What are you guys doing for Halloween? Allison shrugged. I don't know. At my old school, I'd have had plans, but I haven't really been here long enough to care much. She sighed. Maybe I'll just pull out last year's costume. What were you last year? Hermione Granger. I'm a big Harry Potter nerd. I'd love to go as Harry, but I do have the whole breast thing going on, and it's not quite as believable. Sally laughed. Yeah, you're probably more believable as Hermione. Or Ginny. You could go as Ginny. Oh, that could be fun. I never thought of that, but if she could steal Harry Potter's heart, yeah, I'll go as Ginny. I just need to get a red wig. Have you actually read the Harry Potter books? Jay asked Sally. Of course. They're wonderful. Yes, they're children's books, but I keep up with most of the trends. Not all, but most. Hunger Games? Twilight? Yup. I want to know what's popular among kids so I can reach them with my old stuff. Old stuff? He asked with a grin. Hey, that's what the kids call it. I can't expect every one of my students to fall in love with Cyrano like I did. Allison laughed. Trust me, Miss Jackson, with the way you teach Cyrano, there's no way a girl wouldn't fall in love with him. Some of the boys in class were even complaining that they'll never be good enough after the girls heard you talking about Cyrano. Sally bit her lip to keep from laughing aloud. They just need to up their games then, don't they? Jay sighed. What about me? How am I ever supposed to live up to him? You lived up to him the first time you told me you rented the movie. Sally was glad he couldn't see the look she gave him because she knew it was full of love. When I was in Alaska, I wore out a copy of the Jose Ferrer version of the movie. Really? You watched it without me? How could I not? It made me feel closer to you. Oh, I have no more illusions. Now and then, I may grow tender, walking alone in the blue cool of evening, through some garden fresh with flowers after the benediction of the rain, my poor big devil of a nose inhales April, and so I follow with my eyes where some boy, with a girl upon his arm, passes a patch of silver, and I feel somehow, I wish I had a woman too, walking with little steps under the moon, and holding my arm so, and smiling. Then I dream, and I forget, and then I see the shadow of my profile on the wall. Sally stared at him for a moment. That's my favorite quote. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. They want love so badly, but no one ever feels that they're quite good enough to be loved by someone worthwhile. She sighed. Did that even make sense? He nodded. It did to me. And you're worthy. You're so worthy. Allison sighed from the back seat. Wow. My uncle is quoting Cyrano to my English teacher. I can't wait to tell Jessica. Jay groaned. How could I forget she was back there? Sally laughed softly. At least the kids at school don't know you. They all know me. I'm the ogre, remember? He pulled onto the set, showing his driver's license to a security guard who was stationed at the drive. Bob Bodefeld invited me, my niece, and Sally Jackson to come watch the filming tonight. The guard checked a clipboard and nodded. Yes, sir. He handed them each badges. Just wear those the whole time you're on the set. Mr. Bodefeld should be in his trailer. Which one is it? Jay asked, feeling a little overwhelmed. What was he doing there? He was just a rancher. Number 3. Jay looked and saw the numbers on the buildings, then pulled up behind number 3. He got out of the truck, walked to the trailer, and knocked on the door. May opened it wide. I'm glad you guys came. Jay smiled. I am too. He looked over at the truck and saw that Sally and Allison were chatting with one another about something, so he took the opportunity he'd wanted. I want to apologize if I ever made you feel like you weren't wanted. I'd have happily raised you, May. Her eyes immediately welled with tears. She brushed one away with a laugh. I'd blame it on pregnancy, but the truth is, I cry all the time for no reason anyway. Pregnancy hasn't even made it worse. She shook her head. I'm sorry I misunderstood. I really am. I think you're perfect for Aunt Sally, and I love the idea of you two being together again. She leaned close and whispered, make sure you don't blow it this time. She opened the door wide, inviting him in. I drove all the way to Weatherford to get us a taco feast this afternoon. Tacos? You really are going nuts for tacos, aren't you? Jay shook his head. He'd been sure Sally was exaggerating the taco obsession. He heard a squeal from behind him, and immediately turned to see a petite blonde who was very obviously pregnant. Did you say tacos? Come on, Valerie. I brought enough for everyone. Allison and Sally walked over to the trailer, Allison hanging back a little. I didn't think I'd be this nervous, she said in a whisper loud enough for him to hear. This is what you wanted, kiddo. Let's go in and enjoy our tacos. Jay put his hand on her shoulder, glad she was there. This was the first time he felt like he'd done something really good for her. May saw Allison and grabbed her hand, pulling her into the trailer. You need to get a taco before Valerie and I eat them all. We both have a bone-deep need for tacos right now. When Sally stepped into the trailer behind Allison, she saw that Amber was already there, sitting at the table eating a burger. Hi, Amber. Amber smiled. Hey, Sally. I refused to be a part of another taco fest, so I requested a burger. Sounds smart to me. This is Allison, a student of mine. And this is her uncle, Jay. Hi, Allison. Hey, Jay. Bob told me he was bringing some people in to watch tonight. Kind of makes me wish I'd brought my little girl, Nikki, but she would have made it all chaos. Amber set her burger down and stood up, offering her hand to Jay to shake. Really glad to have you guys here. Allison stared at her for a minute before blurting, You're short. Amber laughed. I am. Always have been. I was even shorter when I was a kid. Allison blushed. Sorry. I guess I was expecting you to be kind of larger than life, if that makes any sense at all. A little. We're glad to have you here. We all think Sally's pretty terrific. May tells us she is so often, we have to believe her, so we're glad to have you and Jay as well. She looked at Jay for a moment as if sizing him up. Finally, she held her hand out to him. Be good to her. May needs her still. He frowned at that. She does? I thought she was happy now. She's very happy, but she needs a grandmother for that little Amber she's carrying. Bob stepped into the room and frowned. We're not naming our baby Amber, and you know it. Whatever. I refuse to call her Bobette. Amber wrinkled her nose at Bob, making it clear to everyone in the room what she thought of the name. It's a boy anyway. Bob sat down and sighed when he saw the bag of tacos. Tacos? Again? May pulled a burger out of a bag and handed it to him. I got you and Amber burgers, because you're always complaining about the Great Taco Feast of 2016. How anyone could do that is beyond me. Sally shook her head at May. The Great Taco Feast of 2016? You two have named your taco cravings? Valerie smiled. I didn't know, but I'm all for it. She grabbed a taco and ate it quickly before turning to Jay. It's nice to meet you. Sorry about the taco, but you just don't understand the cravings. Allison stared at Valerie for a moment. You're short too. Valerie just laughed. Amber and I play sisters well because we're just about the same size. I prefer the term petite to short, though. The door opened, and Jesse walked in. He took one look at the table and groaned. Tacos? Again? May pulled another burger out of her bag, which seemed to have no bottom. Sally raised an eyebrow. How many more burgers do you have in your Mary Poppins bag? May shrugged. I'm not sure. Why? Do you want one? Sally shook her head, laughing. No, a taco is fine with me. Did you just get a bunch of each? Sure. Why not? Drinks are in the fridge. Glasses to the right above the sink. Get something to drink and a burger or taco. I'm ensuring that babies don't starve, and the people who love us don't start to hate us for needing tacos. May winked at Valerie, who grinned. You know, it was a lot harder to be pregnant before you started sharing cravings with me. Now it's fun. Valerie sat down and put her feet up on a chair. Jessie looked at her feet. I was about to sit there. Good. You can rub my feet. Allison stared at all the actors she'd idolized for so long in disbelief. Finally, she leaned over and whispered to Sally, They're just like normal people. Sally laughed. They are normal people, yeah, but they're acting like normal people. Is that a problem for you? Allison shrugged, obviously still mesmerized by the famous people around her. Jay reached for a taco, unwrapping the paper around it. I'm not too proud to eat tacos. Bob shook his head. It's not a pride thing. It's a sick of tacos thing. May wants them 3 meals a day. She's always got a crock pot full of taco meat going, and she makes them for herself constantly. May shook her head. Not constantly. I have to write. Sorry. Almost constantly. That sums it up nicely. May continued to eat, ignoring her husband's sigh. She looked back and forth between Sally and Jay. You two aren't engaged yet? Sally's eyes widened. No, of course not. Until Thursday, we hadn't seen each other in over 20 years. May shrugged. Bob proposed within a few hours of meeting me. That was before I knew about the taco thing, Bob grumbled. I asked Valerie to marry me less than 30 minutes after she broke up with her old boyfriend, Jesse added, taking a bite of his burger. John proposed on the first date we'd had in over 5 years, Amber added. Jay, you really need to get with the program. Allison nodded. Yeah, get with the program, Uncle Jay. I refused to ask her to marry me just because all you freaks have no idea how to do things the right way, Jay finally said, not sure how to take them. Jesse grinned at Jay. You know, I'm impressed that you're doing things your own way. Waiting more than a week to propose might be smart. Valerie glared at him. Are you saying you don't like how quickly we got married? Of course not. Jesse patted her knee. We did what was right for us. Maybe Jay is shy or something. Sally grinned. Actually, he is. He even blushes. It's so cute. Jay glared at Sally. Why did I agree to come here exactly? He was honestly so happy to be spending time with her that he couldn't even force himself to be angry. To make Allison happy. Sally looked at Allison. Are you happy now? Allison nodded slowly. A little happy and a little scared. I'm trying to decide which emotion is stronger. She reached for a taco. Definitely hungry for tacos now. She took a bite before adding, I want autographs from everyone. No one at school believed me when I said I was going to come watch you film tonight. Kids are idiots, May said. Present company accepted, of course. I was hoping you'd add that last part, but yeah, they are idiots. No one quite understands. I mean, May and I are practically cousins, so that means Bob is practically my cousin. It's like I'm part of the whole big lazy love family. You're my people. There was laughter all around. Jessie looked at her. You'll get your autographs, but I'm not claiming you as a kid sister. I just got Amber married off, and I thought that was going to take forever. Hey. No one asked you to marry me off. Amber smacked Jessie on the shoulder. Valerie, did you bring a poster? Valerie nodded. There's one on the counter. Amber walked over to the poster and held it up for Allison to see. It had the 4 main stars of the show. We'll all sign this, and I'm going to write a special note on the back. Allison nodded happily. I'd love that. Thank you. She looked around. What about Anthony? Amber wrinkled her nose at the name of her current love interest on the show. He's not here. We don't invite him to family stuff. Just you. Works for me. When they left the set 2 hours later, Allison was staring down at the poster, her eyes shining with excitement. Not only had a dream come true by being able to watch the show getting filmed, but she'd taken selfies with each member of the cast, and she carried a signed poster with her. No one could deny that she'd been there for the special experience. She had proof. Chapter 5. Wednesday evening, shortly before she was headed to bed, Sally's phone rang, and when she looked at the display, she saw Jay's name. Her stomach gave a little flutter as she swiped her finger across the screen and put it to her ear. Hi, you. Hey. What are you up to? His deep voice sent shivers through her, as usual. I just finished grading a stack of essays, so I'm rewarding myself with 2 chapters of May's latest book before I head to bed. She set her Kindle down, giving him her full attention. Am I disturbing you? I'd rather talk to you than read any book. As soon as the words were out, she worried that they were coming too soon. She didn't want to overwhelm him. Oh, really? Even Cyrano? She smiled. You even top Cyrano in my book. Wow. I'll take that as a huge compliment. How's your gelding? He's lots better. Moving around without limping. I'll give him a few more days, and then I think we'll be ready to work again. He paused for a moment. I was wondering if you wanted to go out to dinner tomorrow night. Allison is going to spend the night with a girl from school, and I find myself free to see my special lady friend. Ooh, I'm your special lady friend now? Girlfriend does seem very juvenile. When you're in your 40s, you're a special lady friend. She couldn't help grinning. Is that a yes or a no? I mean, it sounds like a yes to being my special lady friend, but is it a yes for dinner? Well, I have this dance I need to chaperone. You're not going to rope me into that nonsense again. Nope, nope, nope. Dinner? I'll even wear my nice boots, the ones without cow poop all over them. She laughed. Yes, I'll go to dinner with you. And if you're getting all fancy and wearing the boots without cow poop, does that mean I need to wear my ball gown? You have a ball gown? Nope, but I have a nice dress that I got for May's wedding. How about just jeans and a nice top? Are you sure? Boots without cow poop rate at least a skirt, don't they? She loved teasing him so much. How had she lived through the past 20+ years without hearing his voice? I'm sure. Of course, if you want to wear a skirt, I have no problem staring at your legs. Your legs? She blushed, glad he couldn't see her face at that moment. Oh, really? I'll have to find a short skirt so you'll have something to look at. Her shortest skirt came to just past her knees, but she wasn't going to tell him that. Jay laughed. You do that. I'll pick you up around 5. Does that work? Sounds good to me. When he didn't say anything else for a moment, she whispered, I missed you. So much. Me too. Good night, Sally. Good night, Jay. She ended the call and hugged the phone to her. What would she do if he left again? Jay stared at his phone with a grin. Sally was something else. Why hadn't he looked her up as soon as he got back in town? You're thinking about her again. How can you be in love with my English teacher? Allison sounded like she was torn between being disgusted and amused. He shrugged, knowing the goofy grin was still on his face. I loved her a long time before she was your English teacher. Allison walked to the couch and sat beside him. Are you going to marry her? I don't know, he answered honestly. What do you think? Would it bother you? Allison shrugged. I think you two are silly in love. Anyone can see that. I messed up by going to Alaska all those years ago. I should have listened to what she was telling me instead of getting my feelings hurt and running off. I'm not sure she'll be able to forgive that. I think she already has. She has this gooey look when she sees you. Like she's about to melt all over. Trust me, that look isn't there for anyone else. Even Mr. Ward, the new math teacher who's crushing on her, gets the same look everyone else gets. Some of the boys say she's never married because her looks turn men to ice. There's a math teacher crushing on her? Jay asked, worried. I promise, Uncle Jay, she doesn't know he exists. She loves you. Allison shook her head. She gets this look on her face when she's teaching about Cyrano. It's the only time anyone sees a real hint of the woman and not the teacher, if that makes any sense. She gets the same look when she sees you. Jay felt like an idiot talking about his love life with his 15-year-old niece, but who else could he talk to about it? I'm taking her out on Friday night while you're at your friend's house. Really? A real live grown-up date without me? Please tell me you're going to clean your cowboy boots. She wrinkled her nose. Trust me, no woman wants to go on a date with a man who has cow manure on his boots. I already promised I'd wear my good boots. She blinked at him a couple of times. You have more than one pair? Of course I do. I wore the good ones to your parents' funeral. She looked sad for a moment. I miss them. I know you do. I wish I could bring them back, but I can't. He felt like he was completely lost in the world of teenage angst. He had no idea how to deal with it. I know, I'll do my best, but I make no promises when it comes to makeup and girly stuff. Girly stuff? Really? I have friends I can go to for that. Or marry Miss Jackson, and then I can go to her. Allison gave him an impish grin, and he shook his head. I'm not marrying her, so you have someone to go to for girly stuff. He sighed. I don't know that I'll be able to get up the guts to propose again anyway. She made a face. Do you still have the ring? He nodded. Yeah. Can I see it? Why? He asked. What are you thinking? I just want to see what you picked out for her. Okay, I'll be right back. Jay walked into his bedroom, found the ring where he'd hidden it in the medicine cabinet in his bathroom. He couldn't imagine anyone ever looking there for anything, and took it back to her. It was a diamond solitaire, with a small stone. He couldn't see Sally wearing anything too flashy. He put it in Allison's hand and watched as his niece studied it. She turned it over before nodding. It's perfect. It's got the simple elegance that's so much a part of her. He sighed. That's what I thought when I picked it out, but it's been a long time. At this point, you probably know her better than I do. I don't know about that, Uncle Jay. I know her as a student. I watch her a lot because all the kids talk about your history with her, but I don't know her as a person. I've gotten to know her better since she came here Saturday than I have in the couple of months in her classroom. Well, I'm not ready to propose yet anyway. I need to get to know her a little better again. Maybe she's changed. He knew it was a cop-out. It had taken him weeks to get up the courage to ask her to marry him the first time. He'd walked around with the ring in his pocket for more than a month before he'd popped the question. Take your time. I have a feeling she's not going anywhere. She loves you, Uncle Jay. How did you get so smart? He asked softly. Obviously it didn't come from your side of the family. She was smiling after him when he took the ring back to his bathroom to put it up. Sally sat at her desk the following afternoon, trying to finish grading some essays for her senior English class. She taught all the honors classes and one section of regular sophomore English. She couldn't concentrate on them because she was too busy thinking about her date with Jay the following night. She'd decided what to wear 3 different times, and decided against the outfits 3 more times. 2 different teachers had stopped her in the halls to ask about her goofy grin, and her friend Amy, the homemaking teacher, had come right out and asked if she was Twitter-pated. She stared out the window, watching the fall rainstorm pound against the parking lot. She liked walking in the rain, but that storm was a little too hard even for her. It hadn't been raining when she'd left home, so she'd walked. As usual. Leaning back in her chair, she thought about calling it quits and going home because she knew she wasn't going to get any more work done, but she still hoped the rain would ease up a little. The door to her classroom opened, and she looked up. Hi, Mr. Ward. Hi, Sally. Do you mind if I call you Sally? Since all the other teachers called her that, she didn't think it would be polite to tell him no. Sure. He walked over and leaned against the chalkboard behind her desk, obviously trying to look cool. I was hoping you'd reconsider going out with me. I have tickets to a play in Dallas tomorrow night. I have plans, but thank you for asking. I've asked around town, and everyone says you're still hung up on some guy you dated in the 90s. Forget about him and go out with me. The door opened again, and her gaze was drawn to the newcomer. Jay, she said, smiling. Every time she looked at him, she felt as if a light was being lit within her. What are you doing here? Jay looked back and forth between Sally and the man covered in chalk dust. Am I interrupting something? Sally shook her head. Nope. I think Mr. Ward was on his way. Mr. Ward straightened up, one side of him completely covered in white chalk dust from his blue button-up shirt all the way down to the top of his black slacks. I guess I see now why the answer is always no. He looked at Sally. If you change your mind, let me know. You're my first choice, but there are other women too. Sally just smiled. I hope you enjoy the play. She stood and walked around her desk to Jay, hugging him tightly. She knew it was probably tacky to be so affectionate in front of Mr. Ward, but the man needed to get a clue. Jay watched as the other man left the room, and then held her at arm's length for a moment. What was that about? She wrinkled her nose. That's Mr. Ward, the new math teacher. He's asked me out a couple of times, and I keep telling him no. He asked me to go to a play in Dallas tomorrow night. You can go if you want to. We can have dinner another time. I would rather do nothing with you than go to Paris with him. Jay smiled at that. He knew Paris was her dream vacation. Well now, that's saying something. It is. Sally looked up at him. So, what's up? I figured you'd walk to school, so I thought I'd come by and offer you a ride home. I was just thinking about that. I was going to sit here and stare at papers I'm not grading for a while longer to see if the downpour let up a little. He frowned at her. Why are you staring at papers and not grading them? She shrugged. I can't seem to get a certain man off my mind. Mr. Ward is filling up every one of your thoughts, is he? Oh, yeah. I can't stop thinking about him. Sally took a step forward and into his arms, wrapping hers around his waist once more. Thanks for coming to take me home. Are you picking up Allison too? He shook his head. She can ride the bus. He held her close for just a moment. Get your stuff, and I'll drive you. She hurried to her desk and piled her books together. He took them from her as they walked to the door, and she shut off the lights. What did you end up doing this rainy day? He sighed. Paperwork. I hate paperwork. Who took care of the ranch while you were in Alaska? I hired someone. He watched over the house and kept everything going. I didn't want to sell, because I always felt that I'd eventually come back. I'm glad you did. He thought about what Allison had said the night before, about how Sally's face looked the same when he was there as when she talked about Cyrano. He couldn't help but wonder how much was in his niece's head and how much was true. Did you enjoy going to the set the other night? She shrugged. I was with you, so I was content. It wasn't really my thing, but it was fun watching Allison with all the stars from the show. I thought she was going to faint when Valerie suggested a selfie with each of them individually. He grinned. She really was excited. She was sure no one would believe she'd really spent the evening with all of them if she didn't have proof. Well, she got it. They ran through the rain toward his truck and got in, both of them laughing. The rain is getting chilly. It's hard to believe Halloween is in just a couple of days. Do you do anything special for Halloween in class? I usually turn it into a creative writing assignment, have the kids write something scary or just downright gruesome. They love it. He drove the 4 blocks to her house, pulling into the driveway beside her car. I had another reason for coming to school this afternoon, he said, catching her hand before she could get out of the truck. What's that? She asked, turning toward him fully. You wanted to chase away any math teachers who might be lingering to bug me. Well, I didn't expect to find one there with you, he said with a frown. No, I just wanted a few minutes alone with you. Every time I see you, Allison is there. Or May, or both of them. How am I supposed to sneak kisses if there are always people surrounding us? Oh, I see. You came to school because you needed a kiss. I can probably comply with that. Probably? Don't put yourself out. She laughed, scooting toward him on the seat, snuggling her head against his shoulder. Do you have any idea how hard it is for me not to grab you and kiss you when we're surrounded by people? He grinned. Tell me. I'd love to hear how hard it is. I could demonstrate instead. An action is worth 1,000 words. Well, this action, anyway. Go for it, show me what you're thinking. She bunched her hand up in the t-shirt he wore, pulling him down for a kiss. Her other hand went to his hair, toying with it. He kept it so short, it prickled her fingers. When she finally came up for air, she stroked his cheek. How was that for action? It'll work for a bit. He sighed. I want more time alone with you. Why is it that every time I date you, we end up with nieces everywhere? She shrugged. It's probably best this way, but I want more privacy as well. He eyed her house for a minute. We could go in, but I need to get home to Allison, and I have students living on either side of me. Not in my house. Oh, well. We'll have time mostly alone tomorrow. We'll have time in a crowded restaurant. She made a face, unsure what to wear. Are you wearing jeans still? He nodded. I hate dressing up. I feel like I'm going to a funeral. All right. I'll make sure to wear something appropriate, then. Something where I can see your legs, he asked, grinning. Why are you suddenly obsessed with my legs? Nothing sudden about it. I've always been obsessed with your legs, and various other parts of your anatomy. She laughed. Well, maybe you should just keep those thoughts to yourself. Jay grinned, stroking her cheek with the back of his fingers. I'll do my best. See you at 5 tomorrow, right? She nodded. I'll be here. I'm excited and nervous all at once. Why are you nervous? Are you kidding? She asked. We haven't been out alone in over 20 years, and I don't want to blow it again. Again? You didn't blow it last time. I did. Sally smiled sadly. One of us did. I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. I'm not sure my heart could take being broken by you twice in one lifetime. I feel the same, you know. I'm excited and scared and nervous. I want to do things right this time. All those years sitting through winter, which lasts 9 months in Alaska, I thought of nothing but you. I did my job, and I did it well, but you were always there. I'd watch a movie and think, what would Sally think of this? I'd read a book and think that you'd probably already read it. Every minute of every day. No, I can't mess up again. She brushed her lips against his once more. We'll do it right together this time. He watched her as she took her books and ran to the house, unlocking it. After she was inside, he sat there for another minute before backing out of her driveway. He'd wasted 20 years of their lives. How could she possibly be willing to forgive him for that? Chapter 6. Sally tried on 6 different outfits before putting the first one back on. As she looked in the mirror, she wished she'd taken the time to get her hair trimmed. Why hadn't she? She grabbed her phone and made a hair appointment for Monday afternoon so she wouldn't be caught with ugly hair again. Then she picked up her makeup. She hadn't worn cosmetics in long enough that she wasn't sure if she was making herself look like a clown. She felt terribly inadequate, but she wanted to look her best for him. She had 45 minutes, and she thought briefly about calling May to come over and help her, but she knew May would be even more helpless than she was when it came to cosmetics. Finally, she did the best she could and decided not to look again. She couldn't make herself crazy trying to look perfect for him because she was far from perfect, and he already knew it. She was slipping her feet into a pair of flats when the doorbell rang, and she hurried to answer it. She opened the door and stood staring at Jay, her eyes taking in the new pair of jeans and the button-down shirt. You look great, she whispered, noting his new hat as well. He seemed to be holding his breath. Not half as good as you do. She smiled, reaching for her coat and slipping it on. I'm ready. She got her purse and locked the door, following him to the truck. Where are we going? I thought we'd go to a Mexican place I like in Weatherford where there's a live band on Friday nights. It gives me a chance to hold you close, and no one can complain about it. She laughed. That sounds really nice. And we won't be breaking up fights or making teens stop their makeout sessions. I can't believe you just wanted to go dancing and roped me into a school event. I'd take you out every weekend to avoid ever going to another school thing. I might hold you to that. The drive to Weatherford was only about 30 minutes, and they kept up a lively discussion. He told her about a lot of the stupid things tourists did at the park where he'd worked in Alaska. And there was this one woman who thought it was a good idea to take a selfie with a moose. A moose? Why would anyone want a selfie with a moose? No idea, and the worst part is, we'd already told her they were the most dangerous animals in the whole park. So she goes to take her selfie, and the moose turned on her. He broke 47 bones in her body and punctured a lung. She's lucky he didn't get her head with one of his antlers, because she would have been a goner, and all because she wanted a picture with a moose. People are so stupid. She shook her head. That's just crazy. But it sounds like you enjoyed working there. I did. I learned a lot. It was a good time for me to grow and become my own man. He reached for her hand after they pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant. I'd like to take you up there sometime. Maybe next summer. I'd say for a honeymoon, but I'm not going to wait that long to marry you. She looked over at him, surprised. If that's a marriage proposal, you're going to have to study Cyrano a little more. He brought her fingers to his lips. Trust me. When I propose, you'll know it. After they were seated, she looked over the menu, trying to decide. What's good here? Everything. What are you hungry for? Anything but tacos, she answered with a grin. Jay laughed. May and Valerie are both crazy. He tilted his head to one side. You know, I'm kind of sad that we're missing out on the whole kid thing, but I'm glad we're missing out on the pregnancy thing. I can't imagine eating tacos that much. She frowned. You know, if you married someone younger, you could easily still have children. I don't even have a desire to date anyone but you. I'm not going to marry someone else so I can have kids. He stared down at his menu, shocked that she'd even think he was complaining. Didn't she have any idea what she meant to him? His own voice of reason came back and hit him hard. How could she know what she means when I ran off for over 20 years? After they'd ordered, he tried to make her understand. Do you know why I took off to Alaska? She shrugged. You thought I'd rejected you, and you were mad. He shook his head. I was hurt. I wasn't sure I could live in the same town with you, bumping into you all the time. I couldn't be that close and not come to you, begging you to change your mind. He sighed. I know it doesn't seem like it makes sense, but it's the truth. I left because I couldn't do anything else. I thought about you every minute of every day. She bit her lip. But you knew where I was the entire time. You could have called when you knew May would have graduated, even if you did think I meant until she was out of the house. You didn't. I didn't have any idea where you'd gone. I tried to find you on Facebook and with Google, but it never worked. You just disappeared. For all I knew, you were dead. You could have gone out to the ranch and talked to the man I'd hired if you were that worried about me, he countered. I could have if I'd known he was a man you'd hired. I didn't know you hadn't sold the ranch. I knew nothing. One day, you were asking me to marry you, and the next, you disappeared off the face of the earth. You obviously didn't want to see me or talk to me. She realized people were starting to look over at them because of her raised voice. She thought she was over her anger toward him, but as they talked about it, she realized maybe she had a little more forgiving to do. I should have told you what I was doing. I shouldn't have left to begin with. I messed up, and I'm very sorry. He did his best to keep his voice soft, not wanting her to get any louder. She took a deep breath, trying to force her anger down. I didn't realize I was still upset about any of it until just now. He reached for her hand. I'm not going to take off again. I'm here to stay this time. So what if I say I don't want to see you for a little while so I can deal with the anger I'm still feeling toward you? What would you do? Is that what you're saying? I don't know what I'm saying. I still love you, Jay. I never stopped. But I went through more than 20 years not knowing if you were alive or dead, and suddenly you're here, and I want to throw myself into your arms and never let go. At the same time, I want to hit you with the hammer you helped me buy. His lips quirked at her words. I'd rather you didn't hit me with a hammer, but I wouldn't mind if you never let go. She shook her head, unable to stop herself from grinning a little. I think we need to take things slowly. I need to learn to trust you again. I look at you, and my heart starts pounding, and I want to be with you forever, and my heart says it wants to be yours. My head, though. My head is waiting for you to take off on another great adventure. Then we'll go slow. We don't need to get married in a week. We don't need to get married in 2. We can wait until summer, even. She laughed. That's all the longer we can wait, huh? What exactly would he do if she told him he needed to wait years? Well, I do kind of want to take you to Alaska, and there's a short window when we can go because of the long winters. We couldn't go the next summer? What if I want to wait until Allison is done with school? If she sticks with honors classes, I'll be teaching her until she graduates. It could be awkward. She knew she could make it work with teaching Allison. She needed to know his reaction, though. She needed to know what his level of commitment to her really was. He drew a deep breath. I don't want to wait that long, but I will. You let me know when you think you're ready, and I will respond accordingly. So I should let you know when it's time to propose? How do I do this? Just make an announcement? Exasperation filled her voice. He frowned. You're being difficult. I was never difficult before, was I? Maybe I need to be so you won't take me for granted again. I never took you for granted. She looked down at her hands. You're right. You didn't. Let's just move forward. We can't go back and live everything over again, and even if we could, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe this was the path we were meant to follow to bring us to where we are today. He tilted his head to one side, studying her. You never seemed the type to believe in fate. I'm not, for the most part. I do believe in people being meant for each other, though. And I believe we're meant for each other. So I need to get past this so we can go on with our lives. Their food was brought then, and she looked down at the huge plate filled to overflowing. Looks good. He wasn't looking at his food, but at her when he responded. Very good. The drive home was tense. They'd danced, but the things they'd said to each other before the meal were heavy on their minds. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to kiss you goodnight or if I should leave you at your doorstep with a handshake. She sighed, glad he'd broken the silence. A kiss is fine. In fact, a kiss is mandatory. Always. I don't care how much we've fought. I need that kiss goodnight to keep me going. So my kisses are your sustenance? I don't deny it. She shook her head. I wish I could explain better how I feel, but I'm not sure how. My feelings for you haven't changed. I still love you as much as I always did. I just need to learn to trust that you're sticking around this time and not running away from me. I'm not going anywhere. Not without you. We also have to think about Allison and figure out how she feels about everything. Less than a week ago, she was certain I hated her. Oh, she wants us to marry. She asked to see the ring on Wednesday night after we got off the phone. The ring? You still have the ring you proposed with? She was certain he'd have taken it back. Yeah. I hoped you'd change your mind, and it seemed right for you. It's impossible to stay angry with a man who watched Cyrano de Bergerac until he memorized it and kept the engagement ring he bought me. You need to do something totally insensitive so I can be mad again. Sometimes I wonder why you're so illogical, and then I remember that you're a woman. She sucked in a breath, absolutely offended by his words, and then she narrowed her eyes. You said that to make me mad on purpose, didn't you? Yup. Did it work? For about 20 seconds. She realized they were at her house, and she unbuckled her seatbelt, sliding across the seat to him. I need my sustenance now. Just don't bite me, okay? He unbuckled as well, turning toward her and catching her waist in his hands. Come out to the ranch tomorrow. We'll go for a ride and take a picnic along. There won't be many more nice days this year. It's supposed to be in the 80s tomorrow. She thought about the pile of essays that needed to be graded, but shrugged. Sure. I'd love to. Only a teacher with no life got essays back to her students as quickly as she did. She was tired of having no life. He leaned down, brushing his lips softly against hers. Allison will be home around 10, so if you get there around 10:30 or 11, we'll go out. How long has it been since you've ridden? I haven't been on a horse since the picnic you took May and me on. Horses had made her think about him. That's a long time. We'll make sure not to go too far. You don't need to have a sore bum for work on Monday. She made a face. You don't need to be so fascinated with my legs and bum. Did I thank you for wearing a skirt yet? I got to see a whole lot of calf tonight. She laughed softly. I'm not sure why I keep talking to you. Because you love me, and you know I love you. Because we belong together. She sighed. That's probably it. After one last kiss, she slid across the seat and opened the door. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Good night. When she got into the house, she leaned against the door, feeling tears come to her eyes. 20+ years of heartache were still there inside her. Would she be able to get past them so she could have a real relationship with him? Or would they continue to plague her forever? Sally hadn't worn jeans in a very long time, so when she pulled a pair from the back of her closet, she said a quick prayer that they'd fit her. They did, but they were a little tighter than she would have liked. She found a button-up shirt to complete the cowgirl look she was going for. As she drove the short distance out of Wiggyville to Jay's ranch, she could think of nothing but their argument the night before. She really wasn't sure she could get past her fears, and maybe spending time with him was futile. She hoped not, because she couldn't imagine going on as she had. Now that he was in her life again, the past few years seemed so empty to her. She'd lived for her visits with May. She was so excited about her niece being pregnant because it meant she would be a grandmother. Maybe not literally, but close enough. She knew May thought of her as the baby's grandmother. She pulled into Jay's driveway, then got out of her car and went straight to the stables, where she found him saddling 3 of his geldings. Your horse is better, she asked, petting the nose of the closest horse. He shook his head. He's not well enough to ride yet. We'll take these 3 out and give him another day or 2 to rest. He reached over and took her shoulder, pulling her to him. I need my sustenance before Allison joins us. She grinned, tilting her face up for his kiss. For today, she wasn't going to worry about the future. She was going to enjoy being with 2 people she cared about and appreciate every moment. There was a loud throat clearing from behind them, and Sally pulled away with a blush. You're supposed to announce you're coming very loudly as soon as you leave the house. Allison grinned at her. I kind of like sneaking up on you. This side of you is fun because I'm the only kid at school who sees it. I could tell the others, but they wouldn't even believe me. Sally shook her head. Don't tell the others. Let me keep my reputation. Allison shrugged. I think everyone would just think you were human. And they don't now? Well, think about it, Miss Jackson. You never miss a single day of school. You get essays back the day after they're turned in, every time. You always have your hair pulled back and looking just the same. Your clothes are never messy. Everything about you is so perfect. Allison shook her head. Seeing you with Uncle Jay makes you seem so much more real to me. He kisses you, and you blush. When you look at him, your face is different. Jay's eyes were steady on Sally's when she met his gaze. Don't let it go to your head, she whispered. He laughed, reaching out to stroke her cheek. I already know you love me. We'll just see if you can forgive me. He turned away to tie the picnic lunch Allison had made to the back of one of the saddles. Sally put her hand on his arm. I've already forgiven you. It's trust we're working on. Yeah. I remember. He said nothing else as he swung himself up into the saddle. You need help? Sally shook her head. Riding a horse had once been second nature for her. I haven't forgotten. Allison got onto her horse as if she'd been riding since she was a toddler. Where are we going? Jay shrugged. You choose. We'll follow you. Allison led, Jay followed, and Sally brought up the rear. She watched Jay as he rode, thinking about how good he looked in the saddle. After knowing him for more than 20 years, he still made her knees weak. Didn't that mean he was worth trusting? He'd made it clear he was ready to marry her, so why couldn't she just go along with it? Allison found a place on top of a small hill overlooking the Leon River. Sally was a bit stiff as she dismounted, but she walked in a slow circle to try to relieve the soreness of her muscles. After a minute, she took the quilt that had been tied to the back of her saddle and spread it on the ground while Allison got the food and water. "It's a good thing we didn't invite Valerie and May on our picnic," Allison said with a grin. "Why's that?" Sally thought she could use some advice from one of the other women. Maybe she should call May. Everyone was convinced May had all the answers, because she wrote romances, but truly, she was less experienced than just about anyone Sally knew. Except maybe herself. She simply needed to have another woman to talk to about it all. After they'd finished their lunch, Sally leaned against Jay, grateful for his strength. "I can't believe how tired that ride made me. It's been way too long since I've been on a horse." He ran his hands up and down her arms. "I kind of like it that it made you tired. Then I get to touch you more." Allison put her hands over her ears. "I don't think I'm supposed to hear that." Sally made a face. "Don't give the girl more fodder to run to school with and talk about us. Pretty soon, everyone's going to be convinced that I'm a wild woman out for any man I can find." Allison shook her head adamantly. "No way. Everyone knows you're avoiding Mr. Ward because he's crushing on you. He's kind of creepy anyway." "How does everyone know Mr. Ward is crushing on me?" "Who said that?" "Oh, he told everyone in math one day that he was going to ask you out." "What? Are you kidding me?" Sally looked over her shoulder at Jay. "Why would he do that?" Allison shrugged. "I think it's 'cause the boys were talking about you, and one of them said that you don't go out with anyone because you have this thing for a dead guy in a play. Then Mr. Ward said he'd get you to go out with him, and you were too pretty to waste yourself on a man who will never love you back." Sally groaned. "Why do people talk about me? Why can't they just let me live my life however I want to live it?" "No idea. It was a big discussion in Algebra 2 a couple of weeks ago. Or maybe it was last week?" "It was recently." Sally sighed. "Well, that explains his sudden interest in me." "Oh, he was interested in you before that." "How do you know?" Sally couldn't believe how much of the school's gossip the girl knew after such a short time. "'Cause he always stares at your butt when you wear slacks to school." Sally blinked a few times, not knowing what to say. "I think this conversation needs to be over." Jay laughed softly, and Sally could feel him shaking behind her. "Quiet, you. I'm going to have to talk to that freak again." "Want me to do it?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I do, but that's the coward's way out. I'll do it on Monday. If you need me, just let me know." His words were calm, but he still sounded a little too amused to Sally. "I will. Maybe I'll let him take me to a play in Dallas after all." "No, you won't." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because you only get the Cyrano look when you see me." Jay sighed contentedly. It's good to have spies at the school. Chapter 7. Sally spent the time after church on Sunday working on grading the essays she'd been putting off. She still wouldn't have them done as quickly as usual, but surely her students wouldn't care too much. It was late afternoon when her phone rang, and she smiled at the display. Jay. She only had to think his name to smile. "Hello? What are you up to?" She sighed. "Grading papers. Millions of them." Her to-be-graded stack didn't seem to be getting any smaller. "That doesn't sound like a lot of fun." "It's not, but it needs to be done. My students are used to getting all essays back the day after they turn them in. I've spoiled them." She put her red pen down and walked to the couch, hugging one knee and curling the other leg around it. She wanted to see him. Could she tell him that? Would that be too forward? "How about you let me take you away from all that? I have a favor to ask, and I'd rather do it in person. Can I take you to the steak place tonight?" There were only 2 restaurants in Wiggyville, so they tended to be referred to as the Mexican place and the steak place. "Sure. I can do that." She frowned at her pile of papers and refused to worry about them. She had a life finally, and she had a right to live it. "I'll be there about 6. Is Allison coming with us?" "Not tonight. It's just you and me." She smiled, liking that idea. I'll see you then. She glanced at the clock, seeing it was 5. She could probably grade 4 papers before she needed to dress for dinner. Walking back to the table, she got back to work. 15 minutes before Jay was supposed to arrive, she put on a pair of slacks and a blouse she usually wore to work. It wasn't anything fancy, but then again, he hadn't promised to wear his good boots this time. When he knocked, she hurried to the door. "Hi, you." She stepped forward and hugged him. He kissed her quickly, seeming distracted. "You ready? Let me just grab my purse." She locked up and walked toward his truck with him. "It's a nice night. Do you mind walking?" He shook his head. "I'd be happy to." "What's the favor?" she asked. Jay sighed. "I'd rather talk about it over steak." She frowned. For him to be making her wait, it must be something major. "All right." She walked through the familiar streets toward the steakhouse, looking around at everything, feeling nostalgic. "I wanted to work in Wiggyville because I liked the idea of living in such a small town where community was everything." "Are you glad you do?" She nodded. "Most of the time. I hate that I'm watched so closely, as if I'm living my life under a microscope, but I know it's just part of it." "How many people are peeking out their blinds at us?" he asked, a sparkle in his eye. "Only 3 that I've seen so far. Some of them are better at hiding their peeking, though." He shook his head. "I forgot how it is here." "Is it different in Alaska?" "Well, we have the same sense of community, but at least in the area I was in, there didn't seem to be as much of the nosiness, but that's because there was quite a bit of distance between our homes, too. Just a different life there." "You sound like you miss it." "I do sometimes, because every day was a challenge for me. I love being a rancher, and it's what I always knew I'd do. Up there, I was a little bit of everything. A veterinarian, a zoologist, a botanist. It's fascinating to watch the way things change." "Yeah. We barely have seasons in Texas." She kicked at a rock on the sidewalk. "I wish we had the color changes of fall like they do in the north." He nodded. "Alaska has 4 seasons, but you can see them all in the space of about 3 months. And then the long winter starts, again." They got to the restaurant, and he opened the door for her. The hostess looked up. "Table for 2?" He nodded. "Please." She led them to a quiet table near the windows, handing them their menus. "Your server will be with you in a moment." Sally didn't need the menu, she'd eaten there many times over the years. So she set hers down and checked her email on her phone while she waited for him to decide. Once their orders were placed, she gave him her full attention. "What did you need to ask me?" He sighed. "One of my buddies in Alaska is sick. They're already short-staffed this year, and they asked me if I can come up for 2 weeks until he's back on his feet. I need someone to stay with Allison." He didn't know who else to ask. She bit her lip, slowly nodding. "I can do that. She's a sweet girl. Can she come into town and stay with me instead of me staying at your place, though? I'd feel a lot more comfortable, and May's old room would work for her just fine." Her heart was screaming at her for being so calm about him leaving, but what else could she do? Her student needed her. She'd stay at Jay's if she really needed to, but it would feel strange being around his things, and not her own. "You're not mad that I want to go?" He studied her face, carefully. "I'll be mad if you don't come back," she answered, a slight smile on her face. She didn't feel much like smiling at the idea of separation. "You know, we've only been dating for a week again, and already you're off for 2 weeks. "I know. I hated even bringing it up, but it's dead of winter there. They need someone who's done it all before, not a new guy who would need to be trained." "I get it." And she did. She'd given up her off periods to cover for another teacher many times. "Allison and I will be fine." "I know you will." He picked up his salad fork. "I've already talked to her about it. After we finish our salad, I'll call her and tell her to pack. That'll be more than enough time. I knew if you said no, I'd figure something else out." I hope you don't think I'm taking you for granted. She shook her head. Not at all. After dinner, they walked back to her place, and his kiss goodnight was tender. I'll drop her off in about an hour. She's got a key, so if she forgets anything, you can go back to get it. Sounds good. I'm going to miss you. She sighed. I'll miss you too. I wish you didn't have to go. Wrapping her arms around him, she buried her face in his shoulder. I just got you back again. I can tell them I can't make it. No, I can be a grown-up. I just wish you would stay. She sighed. I'm going to put fresh sheets on May's bed and get the room ready for Allison. I'll see you in an hour. He kissed her once more, before leaving. She stood at the door, watching him get into his truck and leave. He'll come back. He promised he would. Allison seemed excited to be there, which surprised Sally. She knew they'd been getting along, but she hadn't expected the girl to be happy to stay with her. My house is tiny for 2 people and we'll be tripping over each other, but May and I did it for 8 years. Allison smiled. It's fine. I get to stay in the former bedroom of an author I love. Sally laughed. Just don't expect extra help with English. I have papers to grade. So that was why Allison was happy to stay. She was still a little bit starstruck by May. Jay looked back and forth, between the two of them, a grin on his face. I'm going to miss both of you. He hugged Allison first. Be good and do what Miss Jackson tells you. I will. Allison made a face. I'll probably miss you too. Probably? He shook his head. That's fine. I'll probably bring you back something fun from Alaska. He hugged Sally next, wishing he was taking her with him. He knew she'd love Alaska and everything about the cold, wild land there. I'll be back in 2 weeks. I don't get much cell reception there, so don't expect calls or emails. She nodded, wiping at a tear that surprised her. I won't. See you in 2 weeks. He surprised her by kissing her once more with Allison standing right there. 2 weeks, he promised, heading for the door. When he was gone, Sally looked at Allison. How's your room? Do you need anything? Allison walked to her and hugged her. I need you to stop thinking you have to act strong for me. I'm going to miss him, but not like you will. You can cry if you need to. Sally smiled. How did you get so smart? Just born that way, I guess. Late Monday afternoon, while she was still at work, Sally received a call from Jay. I'm in Denali. I won't have access to a landline after today, and I'll try to use my cell, but they rarely work. You probably won't hear from me again until I'm ready to head home. I understand. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too. I promise to write. She laughed softly. Every day? That, I promise you, he said softly. No fair, quoting Cyrano from thousands of miles away. How could she not recognize what Cyrano had told Christian in Act 3 of her favorite play? Probably not, but I'm done playing fair. I love you, Sally. Think of me. I can't think of anything else, she said softly, hanging up. She put her head in her hands, feeling the tears falling. She knew it was only for 2 weeks, but it felt like the last time. The door to her classroom opened, and she looked up. I hear your boyfriend left town. She sighed. You need to back off, Mr. Ward. He only left for 2 weeks, and you have no business at all talking about me to students. She stood, piling the book she needed to take with her. She had to leave a little early for a hair appointment. I don't know what you're talking about. A student told me you said you could get me to go out with you. You can't. I'm not interested, and I'm in a relationship. Back off. She picked up her books and walked out of her classroom, waiting for him to follow her out so she could lock the door. He frowned, walking along behind her. It was just a joke. You shouldn't be joking about dating me in the middle of class. I'm not a topic for discussion. She turned and walked toward the faculty parking lot, refusing to spend another moment with him. It was just a joke. Lighten up, She didn't answer, instead going to her car. She stopped by her house to pick up Allison for the drive to Weatherford. Do you want to get your hair done too? Or I can drop you off for some shopping? Oh, hair sounds fun, Allison said. I should get it dyed red for Halloween so I can look like Ginny Weasley. Sally shook her head. Your uncle would kill me, and we really don't have time for that. We can stop and get a wig on the way home. Are you still going to the Halloween party tonight at Cadence? Allison's hair was naturally dirty blonde, and Sally wasn't going to risk the wrath of her uncle. Oh, fine. Just so it's red for Halloween. Allison frowned at her. Let's just do a temporary color. I've always wanted to know if redheads are more popular. No time. Sally sighed, pulling into the beauty parlor. What are you going to have done? Allison shrugged. Just a trim. We don't want to make Uncle Jay mad. She sounded let down that she couldn't have her hair dyed. Well, you might want to make him mad, but I like him happy, Sally said with a wink. Do you think he's having fun? I hope so. When Sally got home from school Friday, she checked her mail as she did every day, and her eyes widened when she saw Jay's familiar scrawl. She opened the letter and smiled. He'd written to her, just like he'd said he would. Dear Sally. I miss you already. I thought coming to Alaska for 2 weeks would be a breeze. I mean, we spent 20 years apart. I find myself wishing you were here with me. I walk down a pathway leading to an old cabin, and I see bear tracks, and wish I could show them to you. I see a moose digging through the snow to get to vegetation beneath, and I think of you. I can't even do a simple task like making coffee in the morning without thinking that you don't like coffee, but I'd make you some hot chocolate instead. I hope you and Allison are getting along, but I'm not worried about her because I know you'll take care of her. Did I mention yet that I miss you? All my love, Jay. Sally read the letter once more, grinning. Allison was sitting at the table when she walked in. Let me guess. A letter from Uncle Jay, she asked, nodding at the letter in Sally's hand. Sally nodded. Yes. He promised to write me, but I was sure he wouldn't remember. Of course he did. Uncle Jay has it bad for you. Oh, that's an exaggeration, I'm sure. But please, exaggerate some more. What do you want for supper tonight? I can make a casserole, or we can go out for something. We could go into Weatherford. Allison jumped to her feet. You don't have to ask me twice. I need to get out of this tiny little town on occasion. Sally realized that she didn't know where Allison had moved from. Where did you live before Wiggyville? Arlington. Ah. No wonder Wiggyville seems too small, then. Sally picked up her purse and keys from where she'd dropped them. Let's go to dinner. Let's go to Arlington for dinner. It would take more than an hour to get there. What do you want to eat in Arlington that you can't get here? Allison sighed. It's not about food. I haven't been back since Uncle Jay got here. I figured if I talked you into eating there, I could talk you into visiting my parents' graves. Sally nodded. Absolutely. If I'd known that's what you wanted, I'd have said yes immediately. It took a little over an hour to get to Arlington, and Allison talked the whole time. I really miss my friends there. Which school did you go to? Sally knew there were several high schools in Arlington. Her college roommate had grown up there. Seguin. It was while she was driving that she realized she'd never talked to Jay about the cancer, and she'd announced on the phone to him that she was at her oncologist's office. She cringed, activating the speakerphone in her car. Call Jay. The computerized voice announced that it was calling Jay, and she waited. He answered, sounding like he'd been running. Sally? Hi. What oncologist? You have cancer? His voice was panicked. She sighed heavily. I'm sorry, Jay. I didn't even think to tell you. Do you have a minute? He needed to hear enough that he wouldn't worry about her until he arrived home. No one should have to hear that evil word about someone they loved without full details. Yeah. I have about 10 till we board. You're on your way, then? Really? Yeah, I'll be there tonight. I'm so glad. She took a deep breath. Okay, here's the deal. I found out in January that I had thyroid cancer. It's a super easy cancer to treat, and they removed my thyroid. I didn't need chemo or radiation or anything because it hadn't spread to my lymph nodes. So you're okay? I'm fine. I take a tiny pill every morning, but nothing else about my life is really any different. I didn't even think to tell you about it, I'm so fine. I've been seeing my oncologist every 3 months, though I'm not sure why, because she never does anything. We just talk and she tells me to come back. I have to see her in January, but after that, I won't see her again for another year. Will it come back? I have no thyroid now. It won't come back. There's always a chance I'll get another kind of cancer, but not this one. Why didn't you tell me? His voice sounded hurt. It wasn't a matter of deciding not to tell you. I just didn't think of it while we were together. I had an amazing surgeon, but if you look closely, you can see the scar on my neck. I'll point it out when I see you. I've got to go. I'll see you tonight. It'll probably be late. Sally frowned, feeling like she'd lost his trust now too. I'll be up waiting for you. When she got home, she found Allison lying on the couch with her feet on the arm, and she was on the phone. Do you really think he likes me? He's so hot. Sally grinned as she walked into the kitchen, starting supper for the two of them. She remembered when the most important thing about a relationship was physical attraction. Well, she and Jay had physical attraction down. Now they just needed to learn to communicate. 10 minutes later, Allison appeared in the kitchen with a letter. Guess who got another letter today? Sally took the letter with a smile. Jay's love letters had gotten worse and worse as time had gone on. She'd always taught her students, and honestly always believed, that every time you wrote something, you became a better writer. She thought that every letter, every essay, every chapter helped you improve. And then she read Jay's love letters. They proved everything she'd believed about writing wrong because they got progressively worse. Of course, his inadequacy just made her love him more. She was sure if he'd written as well as Cyrano, it wouldn't have helped his cause at all. But his letters were perfect, and each one made her heart sing. She opened the letter and read it, smiling to herself. She'd learned not to laugh the way she had with the second letter, because Allison didn't need to realize just how inept her uncle was on paper, although she seemed to know instinctively. After reading the letter, Sally folded it and tucked it into her pocket. Who's the boy? She asked. Allison shrugged. I don't want to say in case it doesn't work out. I can understand that. Though she really wanted to know, Sally didn't press the girl because it could be weird if her teacher knew who she had a crush on. Your uncle's going to be home tonight. I talked to him today. Oh, good. I've kind of missed him. He's missed you too. He mentioned you in every single letter. Really? That's cool. Allison hoisted herself onto the counter. How was the doc's appointment? Really good. I have to go back in January, and then I'll go down to once a year. Awesome. That's for your cancer, right? Sally nodded. You knew about my cancer? Yeah, all the kids talk about it. Some of them say you're superhuman because you only missed a week of work. I'm not superhuman. Sally dug into the fridge to find garlic cloves. Well, they say you are. I'm glad you didn't die. Thanks, I think. Hey, I've always had this idea that if someone lives through a bad car wreck or cancer or something, they should get a glad you didn't die cake. May I bake you one? Sally shrugged. Sure. Why not? You can make it as one of our Thanksgiving desserts. You're doing Thanksgiving with me and Uncle Jay? Sally grinned. We haven't talked about it yet, but it's coming up fast. Can you see your uncle fixing an entire Thanksgiving meal? I figured he'd just take us out somewhere and we'd have restaurant food. Well, that doesn't sound very Thanksgiving-like to me. Being together sounds great. Allison walked over to peer out the window. How long before he gets here? I'm not sure. He said it would probably be really late, but I'm going to wait up. Really? Allison asked. Can I wait up with you? Sally wanted to say no, because she wanted to see Jay alone. She wanted to be able to fly into his arms and hug him, but she knew she'd feel uncomfortable with his niece there. Yeah, sure. Oh, good. Let's have a pajama party and watch sappy movies while we wait. I know. We can watch Lazy Love. We'll have a marathon, starting with the first episode. After dinner. Sally could sit through the show, again. She'd watched everything once so she could talk to May about it, but watching once more wouldn't kill her. She liked the show, but she wasn't obsessed with it like certain people she knew and loved. After they'd finished their meal, they changed into their pajamas and snuggled under lap quilts on the couch to watch the show. After each episode, Allison would need to discuss what she thought of Bob's role, and they would take a break for fresh drinks, popcorn, or the bathroom. It was close to 3 in the morning when there was a very soft knock on the door, as if the person knocking was trying to not wake them. Allison paused the show and looked at Sally. I think I'll go to the bathroom. Before Sally was even at the door, the girl had disappeared. Sally hurried to the door and opened it wide, a little embarrassed by her Minnie Mouse pajamas, but not enough to hold off on throwing herself at Jay. I missed you. His arms closed around her, and he held her tight. I missed you too. He lifted her off her feet. She sighed. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the cancer. It's really such a non-issue at this point that I didn't think about it. We had so much we were dealing with. I don't want you to think I was hiding anything. He set her on her feet and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He looked at the 2 quilts on the couch and both drinks. This looks like a party for 2. Allison went to the bathroom to give us some privacy. He grinned, sitting down on the couch and pulling her down beside him. She's a good niece sometimes. Are you mad at me? He shook his head. No, not at all. I can understand that it slipped your mind. I didn't mention that I almost got eaten by a bear once either, and I don't want you to hold that against me. She blinked a couple of times, looking at him. You almost got eaten by a bear? He nodded. Most of the bears in Denali are herbivores. There just isn't enough meat there for them, so when they run across prey, they tend to really go after it. I ran into a bear while I was out on patrol, but I was able to hold my ground and stare him down. I lived to tell about it. Please, don't ever almost get eaten by a bear again. I won't if you don't get cancer again. I'll do my best, she promised. Jay frowned. I'll do my best, then. You can't expect me to promise when you're not going to. I liked your letters, she said softly, thinking about the last one she'd read just that afternoon. Really? How many have you received? 7. They started coming last Friday, and I got 2 one day. You really liked them? You didn't think they were terrible? Sally grinned. They were absolutely dreadful. But they made me smile, and they made me laugh, and they made me feel connected to you, even though you were a million miles away. It's actually about 4,000 miles. I was speaking in hyperbole, and that's okay, because I know what hyperbole is. He sighed. I'm glad you liked the letters, and they made you feel close to me, but I'm sorry they were dreadful. Maybe I didn't watch enough Cyrano after all. I'm sure you watched it enough. You can quote it to me, after all. I loved your letters, because I knew they were coming from your heart. They just weren't, well, they were a bit odd for love letters. I couldn't get out to mail any after Saturday, so I brought you the ones I wrote this week. I can't wait to read them. You're not grading them, are you? I can just picture you taking a red pen to them like you do your students' essays. Sally shook her head. I promise I'm not grading them. Good. How was your flight? She asked, wondering why he hadn't kissed her yet. He shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. Long. I had a layover in Minneapolis. It's 5 hours from Fairbanks to Minneapolis, and then 3 hours from Minneapolis to DFW. I spent 8 hours on planes. You should go home and get some rest. I can deliver Allison in the morning, or you can take her. She's in her pajamas, though. I'd rather spend a little more time with you, if you don't mind. She grinned, shaking her head as she fought back a yawn. I'm sleepy, but I'm so glad you're here, I don't care. She leaned toward him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and pulling him in for a kiss. I missed you all the time, even when I was at work. Knowing you were 1,000,000, or 4,000, miles away made me miss you more. I hated it. He stroked her cheek with the back of his fingers, smiling. I missed you too. I think I told you that at least 6 times in every letter. She did her best not to laugh at his mention of letters, but she knew her lips twitched. You did. It was wonderful. Are you still laughing about my letters? She shrugged. I'm sorry. They amused me. I loved them, though. He sighed. I put all that effort into writing you every day, just like I promised, and all I get is amusement. No, you get a lot more than amusement. You get undying love and delight. Those letters felt like a lifeline to you. Yes, they amused me, and I can't deny that, because they were funny. But they were special as well. I'll always treasure them. He slipped his arm around her and held her close to his side. I should have given you my address so you could write me love letters too. It never occurred to me to write you. That's not fair. He frowned at her. You're the English teacher. You have a way with words, not me. Why am I writing letters, but you don't have to? I wrote about you in my journal every day. Jay tilted his head to one side. Do I get to read your journal? She frowned, thinking about all she'd written about him in the past. She'd mentioned him at least once a day for as long as he'd been gone. There were boxes and boxes of journals, and his name was on every page. No, he wouldn't be seeing them. I can't let you read my private thoughts. He frowned. Keeping secrets again? Not at all. Some things just aren't meant to be read. He thought about that for a moment before nodding. I can understand that. Are y'all kissing? I don't want to see that. Allison called from the kitchen. If we were before, we've stopped now. Sally called back, snuggling closer to Jay's side. She was not going to be embarrassed to show affection in front of the girl. Allison came into the room, grinning. Hi, Uncle Jay. I missed you a little bit. Jay laughed. Only a little bit, huh? She nodded. Yup. And Miss Jackson took me to see my parents' graves. I want to go more often. He blinked a couple of times at the quick change of subject. Anytime you want. You just let me know. Some people get sadder when they're asked to visit graves, but if it's something you feel like you want or need to do, we'll do it as much as you want. Thanks. She sat down next to Sally. Let's watch the next episode. Jay looked over at his niece. What exactly are we watching? Lazy Love, of course. This is the one where someone holds Joanne and Mary Beth hostage and Dr. Dillon has to come in and save the day. I think they should have had Bob save the day, but the writers have to be predictable. Allison started the show. Jay looked at Sally, who shrugged at him. She didn't care if they watched the show as long as she got a little more time with him. He sighed and covered the two of them up with her quilt, reaching over for a handful of popcorn. Chapter 9. When Sally woke the following morning, she had a crick in her neck. She groaned, realizing she was sitting up. Why on earth am I sitting up to sleep? She turned her head to see Jay's blue eyes flutter open and look into hers. Did we spend the whole night here? She asked, sitting up and trying to work the kinks out of her sore muscles. She looked over and Allison was gone. Obviously, she'd been smart enough to go sleep in May's old room, which meant Sally had slept on the couch with Jay, alone. She looked at him, eyes wide with alarm. We just slept on my couch together all night. What time is it? She reached across him, practically climbing on top of him to get to her phone to check the time. Oh, wow. I didn't need to see that. Allison said, covering her eyes. Get a room. Jay looked at Sally, surprised. This won't look good. He knew there was nothing for his niece to be embarrassed about, but could he convince her of that? No, it doesn't. My teacher shouldn't be on top of my uncle when I'm in the house. You. Allison frowned at them. I'm going to go pack up my things. She rushed from the room, peeking through her fingers to ensure she didn't see anything else she shouldn't. Sally pulled away, her face flaming. She glanced down at the time on her phone. It's noon. Do you have any idea how many people must have seen your truck in my driveway? She felt panic overwhelm her. Teachers in this town have lost jobs for being caught in compromising positions. It's 2016, not 1890. It's fine. There'd been a silly story going around Wiggyville about a teacher who had been caught kissing the father of one of her students in the schoolhouse in 1890, and had been fired immediately. The kids in town had always loved the story, and it seemed to have been embellished over the years. There were some versions that had the fired teacher walking out to the home of the man she'd been kissing and demanding that he marry her. Some people even said she'd been a mail-order bride who'd arrived late to find her groom already married to someone else with the same name. It had been a mail-order misfortune all around. She took deep breaths. In theory, it's fine. People in this century have sex before marriage all the time, but I don't. I'm a 46-year-old virgin, and I think everyone in town knows it. My reputation has always been impeccable. But I have students living on either side of my house, and there's no way your truck wasn't spotted in the driveway, and Allison walked in on us with me all but lying on top of you. She'd been trying to get her phone, but whatever. She should have asked for it. What was she thinking? You're really upset. He had never seen her quite so worked up about anything. Of course I'm upset. This is a small town. Do you have any idea how many phones are ringing right now? I'm surprised the principal isn't at the door. She looked at the entrance out of the corner of her eye, half expecting to hear a knock. So we'll get married today. It won't hurt a thing. He wanted to marry her anyway. Why not? Today? It's Saturday. And Texas has a 3-day waiting period. He shrugged. We'll drive across the border into Oklahoma, where there's no waiting period. An old friend of mine is a minister there. I'm sure he'll marry us. He was warming up to the idea more and more, his mind racing to figure out how they could make it work. We can't get a marriage license on a Saturday. Why can't we? My friend's got connections. I'm calling him. She sighed, rubbing her hands over her face. How far across the border are we talking? Could they actually make it work? She'd already decided to tell him she was ready to move forward with their relationship because she didn't like being separated even for a minute, so she wasn't completely opposed to the idea. She'd never wanted a long engagement anyway. Not far. 20 miles or so. So 2.5 hours each way? Really? She shook her head. Maybe we should just get a marriage license tomorrow and have the pastor here marry us later in the week. Do you want to go to church tomorrow, knowing everyone saw my truck in your driveway? Jay wasn't sure he'd ever convince her to marry him any other way. He was going to hold on to the idea of a quickie marriage for as long as he could. Sally sighed. No, I don't. Fine. Let's go get married in Oklahoma. Call your friend and see what he can do. I'll find a dress. I'm not getting married without May, though. She looked at the phone in her hand and dialed her niece's number, knowing she'd wake her. Hello? May's voice was very sleepy, but Sally knew she would never be forgiven if she married without her niece present. May, I'm about to drive to Oklahoma to get married. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jay dial a number and walk into the next room to talk. I need you there. Today? May was obviously too sleepy to comprehend what was happening. Today. Right now. I need you with me. You can bring Bob. Not that May needed to be told to bring Bob. He was always welcome if May was. May yawned loudly. Bob. I'll tell Bob. She took a deep breath. Okay, give me an hour to get dressed and into town. I can do this. Thanks. Meet at my house. Sally ended the call and looked at Jay. He nodded and finished the call. My pastor friend has a buddy at the county courthouse. Both will meet us there with the paperwork, and we'll get it handled, and then my friend will marry us. He looked down at his wrinkled clothes. 2 flights and sleeping on a couch did not make for a neat appearance. I'm going to go home, shower, and dress in something more weddingy. Like your cowboy boots without the cow poop? He was the only man she knew who determined if his boots were his good ones by the amount of manure present. Exactly. I'll be back in an hour. He hurried to her, leaning down to kiss her. This isn't how I wanted our marriage to happen, but I'll be so happy being married to you that it just doesn't matter. Sally rested her head against his shoulder. We'll make it work. He frowned, wishing she was as happy as he was about marrying. Realizing they were in a time crunch, he turned and yelled, Allison, get out here. Allison walked out into the dining room, frowning. What's all the yelling about? I'm not the one who got caught making out. She folded her arms across her chest like she was waiting for him to apologize. We weren't making out. He shook his head. I don't have to explain anything to you. I'm going home to get showered and changed, and we're driving to Oklahoma to get married. You coming? Allison looked between Sally and Jay, her face lighting up. You're not pregnant, are you, Miss Jackson? No, I'm not pregnant. I have done nothing that would make me pregnant. Hey, I didn't ask about your sex life. Allison held up her hands to ward off more information and looked at her uncle. I'll go with you so I can get a decent dress to wear. And you need to wear your good cowboy boots. Sally already told me. I do know not to have cow poop on my boots for a wedding, especially mine. Jay strode toward the door. You need to get ready fast. Allison hurried out before him, a little skip in her step. Sally watched them go and headed to the shower. She spent 10 minutes fixing her hair. Before digging through her closet, she decided on the mint green dress she'd worn for May's wedding. It was nice and new, even if it wasn't white. She was ready just as her niece got to her door. May grabbed Sally in a huge hug. I can't believe you're finally marrying Jay. I'm so happy for you. Sally sighed, briefly explaining what had happened the previous night and what it had led to. May laughed. No one is going to think any less of you if you don't marry him. You're 46. Sally shrugged. I'm going to do it. I love him. You always have. I'm glad you're doing it, even if the timing is a bit off. I think you'll be happier. You always think people will be better off married. You're a happily ever after kind of girl. May grinned. There's no other type of ending worth reading or watching. Where's Bob? He dropped me off and then went to get gas. The smell is bothering me since I've been carrying little Bobette. May patted her tummy with a grin. Sally forced herself not to cringe at the name. You don't know if it's a boy or girl yet, do you? She was sure May wasn't far enough along for that. No, I don't, but Bob insists it has to be a boy because he's in competition with Jessie, whose first is a boy. I want a girl. I'm not quite sure I'd know what to do with a boy, so I call it Bobette. Sally started at the knock on her door, walking over to open it. Jay stood in front of her, dressed nicer than she'd seen him dress in a very long time. He wore a suit and his good boots. Hi. Hi. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple jumping. Are you ready? Sally nodded. We need to wait for Bob to come back. He went to get gas. He pulled up right in front of me. Okay, then. I'm ready. I gave him directions, so he and May can follow. He held his hand out to her, and she put hers into it. Let's get this done. 3 hours later, Jay and Sally were legally married. She looked down at the ring he'd slipped onto her finger during the ceremony, surprised he'd thought to bring it. They'd been in such a rush, she was certain he'd forget. After Jay thanked his friend for performing the ceremony and making the paperwork easy, they left the church together. Allison was walking between May and Bob. Sally listened to her chattering. I can't believe I'm related to Bob and May Bodefeld now. It's like all my dreams that I didn't know I even had have come true. Sally grinned, looking at Jay, who seemed as if he was stifling a laugh. She's really excited. I'm glad. She was excited about co-parenting, co-aunt and uncling, with him. She knew they'd make a good team. Jay nodded. Me too. I've been worried about her being unhappy when we married. When and not if. He'd been more sure of her than she'd been of herself. I knew I'd eventually wear you down with my kisses and love letters. Sally's face was serious when she nodded. Of course. How could you not? May turned to Sally, a grin on her face. We were wondering if we could borrow Allison tonight. She wants to learn about writing romance novels, so I thought this would be a good time. Allison rolled her eyes. They know you're trying to get me out of the way for the wedding night. Just tell them the truth. Sally blushed, but nodded. Please take her. I've had enough of her this week. She winked at Allison so she'd know she was kidding. Allison hurried over and hugged Sally. Thanks for being my new aunt. I think you're going to make Uncle Jay very happy. Have fun with May and Bob, and we'll see you tomorrow afternoon. Don't forget that you have an essay due first period on Monday. I'll have May help me. She's a writer. May wrinkled her nose. We'll see how that works out for you, kiddo. I write fiction. Allison looked at Jay and buried her face against his shoulder. I'm glad you're going to be happy now. She wrapped her arms around him and held tight. Jay stroked his hand over her hair. Thanks. I love you. Suddenly he wasn't worried about saying it to her. The words were right, and she needed to hear them. Allison looked at him, tears in her eyes. I love you too, but don't let it go to your head. She hurried off with May and Bob. You'll need clothes. Sally called as she got into Bob's car. May turned. Does she still have some at your house? Yeah. In your old room. We'll stop and get them. I still have a key. They got in the car and drove off, leaving Jay and Sally staring after them. You'd think it was their wedding night, the way they're rushing off, Jay said, grinning at her. Sally refused to talk about the wedding night because she was starving. I'm hungry, you need to feed me. I haven't eaten a bite all day. Do you want to look for something close to here? Or get on the highway and see what we see? He wanted to forget about heading back to Texas and find a hotel room instead, but he didn't say that. I think if you don't feed me soon, I'm going to go off into hangry land, and you won't like me when I'm hangry. Once they were in his truck, he drove through the streets of the small town until he spotted a diner. Looks like a little mom-and-pop place. Food in those is usually good. Does that work? She nodded. Seriously, right now they could give me a box of crackers, and it would make me happy. He pulled into the tiny parking lot. I can't starve my bride to death. I'm glad we're married, she said softly. Jay leaned over and brushed his lips over hers. I am too. He stroked her cheek gently. Are we okay? He didn't want there to be lingering problems between them as they started their marriage together. She nodded slowly. We're okay. I was worried you'd be upset that I stayed longer in Alaska than I was supposed to, but I couldn't help it. I was watching the weather. When I saw the storm, I knew you'd be delayed. Not quite as long as you were, but it was fine. She bit her lip. Are you upset that I didn't tell you about the cancer? He shrugged. I was hurt at first. I couldn't imagine why you wouldn't tell me, but if it really is a non-issue now, that makes sense. He put a forefinger under her chin and tilted it up, looking at her neck. I can see the scar now that I know it's there. It's really light, though. Yeah, my doctor did a great job on it. Her hand went to touch it, though she wasn't sure why. Every time she thought about it or heard the word cancer, her fingers were there, touching the scar. They went into the diner, hand in hand. After they were seated and had made a decision about food, Jay set his menu down. Are you going to sell your house? She shrugged. I hadn't really thought about it yet. I guess I will. That's what makes sense. They certainly wouldn't all fit in her tiny place. You could also rent it out, if that appeals to you. Do you have an opinion? We're married now, and we're supposed to make decisions together. As she looked at him, she realized how right it felt to say that. She had married the love of her life, Jay Graber. Wow. I just realized I'm going to have all my students call me Mrs. Graber now. I like it. He smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. Do you really? You trust me now? She nodded. I do. I realized from those love letters you wrote that I really do mean a lot to you. How did they tell you that? He knew they'd been ridiculously bad, but he'd done his best to pour his heart out to her. Well, maybe toward the end, it had been fun to see just how bad he could make them, but he'd never tell her that. Sally grinned. Because you cared enough to do something so sweet for me, even though you knew you weren't good at it. He shook his head. Weren't good meaning, abominably awful? You got your point across. Your letters were real, and they were a connection to you that I needed. Thank you for writing them. They really did mean a lot to me. Jay smiled. I'm just glad they did something other than tickle your funny bone. I do know everything isn't always going to be perfect between us, but I want you to know we're starting this marriage with a clean slate. I won't bring up you leaving again. It's over. I'm glad. I've wanted to be married to you for so long. All those years in Alaska helped me to be a stronger, better man for you. I hope you don't resent them. On one level, he did wish he'd never left, but on another, he knew he hadn't been ready for marriage then. He was now. She shook her head. I don't, because I became a stronger, better woman for you. Let's make sure we keep concentrating on the good we've been through together instead of the bad. That's easy. Really, we've only ever had one serious argument. I love you, Jay, and though I wasn't planning to marry you today, I was going to let you know that I was ready to move forward with our relationship as soon as we had some time alone. Well, I'm glad it worked out like it did, because I don't have to agonize over waiting for you anymore. Now we can move on with our lives like we could have 20 years ago if I hadn't misunderstood you. He shrugged, not worried about it anymore. She was his. Finally. Sally shook her head. That's behind us. From now on, we're only going to think of our future. And how good it will be. Epilogue. May leaned against the counter in Sally's kitchen, watching as Sally peeled a small mountain of potatoes. Allison stood beside Sally, arranging apples onto a pie crust. Thanks for letting me make apple pie using my mom's recipe, Aunt Sally. I hate the idea of having a frozen apple pie on Thanksgiving. May shook her head. We may be cousins now, but you really worry me, Allison. The point of Thanksgiving is to let everyone else do the cooking so you don't have to. Sally glared at May. Just for that, you can go get a stick of butter from the fridge and smear butter on top of all the dinner rolls. All right. May frowned, but did as she was told. How was your trip to Wyoming? Did Bob enjoy the grand opening of the burger barn? May rolled her eyes. You know he ate it up. There's a place called Bob's Burger Barn in this world, and he got a chance to be part of the grand opening? The man is obsessed with Bob Power these days. What on earth is Bob Power? Sally shrugged. Don't ask me. You married him. She put the potatoes on the stove to cook and pulled the turkey from the oven. She slipped the pan of dressing she'd made into the oven where the turkey had been and poured the drippings from the pan into another so she could make gravy. Did you like Wyoming? We liked it a lot, and actually, we decided to move there. May said the words quickly, as if she was worried about the reaction she'd get. Wait. You and Bob are moving to Wyoming? May nodded. To Culpeper, where Valerie and Jesse have their ranch. It's a beautiful little town, and we love the people there. Sally frowned. I know you can work anywhere, but Bob needs to be here. We'll be here for 3 weeks, and then in Wyoming for a week. We'll stay there when he has breaks from filming. We bought a little ranch that had been neglected. Bob has big plans for it. Bob's going to ranch? May laughed. Of course not. The man looks good in his cowboy boots and hat, but can you imagine him really roping a cow? No, he's hired someone to run it. He's planning a treehouse for Bobette. Sally grinned at the mention of the baby. I'm glad you'll still be here several weeks every month. Then I can get my hands on that baby of yours. Have you picked out your grandmother name yet, Aunt Sally? Allison asked. Sally smiled, shaking her head. I think I'll just let her call me whatever she wants to call me. Have you decided it's a girl too? May asked. I'll go along with whatever you want it to be, to help torment Bob. Allison frowned. I can't help torment Bob. I'm on Team Bob. So am I. May said. But it's our duty as loyal Team Bob members to keep him from getting a swelled head. He's already well on his way. Allison considered that for a moment and then nodded. Works for me. Jay walked into the kitchen then, wrapping his arms around Sally's waist from behind as she whisked the flour and water for gravy. How much longer? Bob is starving to death, and football isn't distracting him any longer. Sally smiled, pleased with her world. She loved being married to Jay, and Allison was, despite her normal teenage problems, a good kid. Give us 30 more minutes. She knew it wouldn't take that long, and Bob would be happy when it was done sooner. Tell him that since I'm not getting tacos for Thanksgiving, he can just hold his horses. May said, wrinkling her nose. Sally sighed. Would you really have eaten tacos for Thanksgiving? Do pigs turn into delicious bacon? Of course I would have. May shook her head. I have taco meat in the crock pot, and I'll have tacos for supper tonight. I'll send lots of leftovers home with Bob so he doesn't have to eat your food. You're spoiling him, May protested. You're killing him with tacos. Allison responded. Bob needs real food, not tacos 24/7. That baby really is going to be born with cheese for hair. What is your problem? Sally laughed. It was the first time Allison had treated May like she was a normal person and not someone famous. It made her feel like Allison was settling in better. She has a point, May. Jay kissed Sally's cheek. I'll just go tell Bob that it'll be 30 more minutes, and promise him leftovers for dinner tonight. If he asks you to call him King Bob, tell him he's just the court jester. May called after her uncle. Sally exchanged a look with Allison, and they both burst out laughing. I don't know which of them has more issues, Bob or May. I think it's a tie, but that's okay, because they're both family. Allison grinned. If you told me 4 months ago that I'd be able to smile on my first Thanksgiving without my parents, I'd have called you a liar. But I can. Thanks for making me part of your family. Sally set down the whisk she was using and hugged Allison. I married Jay because I loved him so much. You were a huge bonus. Allison smiled. Happy Thanksgiving.